Test, test.
Hey, good morning to everybody. Welcome to the last meeting of the IESBA June board meeting at the end of a very, very intense and productive week. But we still have a few topics that we have to go through and address. What is waiting for our assessment is today is an update from the technology, a presentation from the technology, the update from the technology working group, and we will have a presentation that I will kindly ask David Clark to introduce. Then we will have to see and comment on the turnaround documents, which in this case in the form of slides, fortunately, and thank you to the staff for having prepared these slides. And then we will reach the end of our public session before lunch with some closing remarks and some issues, some administrative issues to address, followed by the usual executive session after lunch, which I anticipate is going to be a very good executive session with some topics to be discussed there and to be discussed and seen there, which will be important. I hope that you all had the opportunity last evening to relax a little bit. For those, of course, after reading and seeing the slides, I'm not saying the contrary, but the staff was so kind that provided us with slides instead of the whole set of the documents, which I'm sure made the life of us all much easier. Thank you, staff, and even allowed some of you to have some good moments after reading and seeing the slides with Michael Jackson and so on. So it's very good to see that everything is possible within the 5 days of the week in New York. So David, thank you very much for taking the lead of this group for the reasons that we all know and that I don't have to repeat. Thank you for leading the group, and thank you for your update today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Very kind words. And thank you, Board, for the opportunity to present back the technology update on activities performed since March. I think it would be remiss of me not to pay some tribute to Brian's outstanding contribution to the Technology Working Group and his overall approach, I think, to technology. And when I reflect on this as the now Chair, Brian has really left the TWG in a really advanced state. And when I think about the phase 2 report over and over since January, it's even relevant today after the advent and the explosive nature of generative AI. So for that, the TWG is very thankful. And just a reminder that the TWG Technology Working Group consists of Paul Mathora, myself, and we're ably powered by our own AI, our powerful AI, and Jean Vision. And we've been very lucky also to have the input from John Reed, who was really our liaison to the technology experts group. So thank you, John, for your continued help in this space. We also look forward to Joanna Field's help as we collaborate and continue our liaison with the IESB's technology work. So the next slide, please, John. So today we want to take the opportunity to really socialize the updated terms of reference with the board. We also want to give you an update on the technology working group's activities since December and bring to you some of the technological advancements that we've seen in conversations with the technology experts group as well. In line with the terms of reference presented back in December by Brian, the Technology Working Group are bringing you some education today, thanks to our expert Daniel Supkis-Cheek, who's online, I believe. And she'll focus on generative AI, large language models. And this piece will really build on the excellent presentation we received in Abu Dhabi from Laura Friedrich as well on ChatGPT. Danielle, just as a word, is also part of the Technology Experts Group. Next slide, please. All right, so there was an initial set of terms of reference for the Technology Working Group, and that was really to develop and facilitate the development of non-authoritative materials, and that would focus on raising awareness and the ethical implications of technology-related developments for professional accountants. And it would help, of course, PAs and the wider context of PAs in understanding and how to cope with dilemmas or conflicts in the technology space, including with respect to independence. But, you know, with the launch of both phase 1 and phase 2 reports, I think we can pare back a little bit on some of the non-authoritative materials, but we're still open, of course, to hear from other work streams where there is some work that's required where technology is concerned. We were also tasked with identifying and assessing the potential impact of technology on the behavior of professional accountants and the relevance and applicability of the code. In this new phase of the technology working group, we're going to bring you more regular internal education, which we're doing today, of course. We'll conduct, but substantially less intensive, of course, environmental scanning to monitor the developments and bring you those developments as and when is appropriate. And this is really quite important, I think, to keep us honest as a board, keep our finger on the pulse so that we don't drop the ball where technology is concerned, as we're focused on other topics such as sustainability. We will maintain our capacity for ad hoc analysis of technology-related issues, and we will liaise with other IESBA work streams to understand some of these emerging trends as and when they're seen. And then we'll maintain a capacity also for engaging with other IESBA work streams or stakeholders to facilitate the implementation, of course, as the TWG's phase 2 recommendations. Thus far, this year, we've focused on environmental scanning. We're giving a report back today, of course, and we're going to really focus on some more regular education sessions, and we hope to bring at least 2 to you this year. Next slide, John. All right, I just want to give you a flavor of some of the activities and the coordination that the technology working group has had. We have met once with the technology experts group itself in May. We'll bring you some of that feedback, as I said. And just as a word, we're a year into having the help from the technology experts group, and we will make sure that we continue to have the right mix and expertise whilst balancing the geographical representation of that technology experts group as well. We'll also well, we've yet to do this, but Vanya will be reaching out very shortly to do this, but we hope to liaise, of course, with the Emerging Issues and Outreach Committee on a more regular basis and coordinate our efforts so there's no duplication, if you like, in the work that we're both performing as working groups and work streams. And, you know, we can hand off items that we see that are not necessarily technology working groups remit, and you can do the same in the vice versa approach. TWG will continue to coordinate, of course, with the IEESB's technology consultative group. Joanna Field will be instrumental in that. Is she joining us today, Jean? Joanna Field? No, okay. But she will in going forward. We're requested, of course, by IESBA work streams and stakeholders where there are some draft non-authoritative materials that might have some aspects of technology. IESBA staff will help, and where appropriate, and the technology working group will help review those before they go to press, so to speak. And of course, we look forward to the continued help of the IFAC communications team as we explore, including the exploration of potential outreach activities to promote the code as an effective tool for professional accounts as they address technology. So with that, let me pause here if there are any reflections or comments at this stage before we give you a report back from the technology experts group.
Thank you very much, David. Any comments from the board? Questions?
And anything, Paul, that you would like to add, or Jean? Okay. All right.
That's fine.
We shall move on. So we'll go to the next slide. All right. Technology doesn't seem to be failing us today, does it? That's good. All right, so I want to give you a kind of overarching comment before I go into some of these highlights. I think that the new technology provisions really help frame the discussion with the technology experts group, and it resonated throughout that discussion, and that we were able to tie it back into the new provisions and leverage the provisions to explain away some of the items that were discussed from the technology experts group. But I'll bring you some of the highlights from that meeting right now. Obviously, there's a real concern at the sort of rapid development and evolution of technology and the pace of change. And so they brought it to our attention that there seems to be, in the professional accountants arena, a broad spectrum of reaction to this because it's really caught folks off guard, right? Since November and ChatGPT. And so there's these reactions extend from banning the use of ChatGPT to incorporating very quickly ChatGPT and other generative AIs into their daily operations. And just as a reminder, ChatGPT, of course, took 5 days to reach 1 million users. Whereas Netflix took 3.5 years, Twitter 2 years, and Facebook 10 months, right? So this is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with an exponential change, which is impacting the profession. To give you another example of some of the disruption that's been caused, if you think about the top 5 skills that are heralded on LinkedIn, they've all changed in the last 5 months, and there's obviously no surprise that they're all related to generative AI in some way. So it's something to keep an eye on. The regulatory member of the TEG stated quite emphatically, I think, that they're not going down the route to ban the use of generative AI such as ChatGPT, as of course what happened momentarily, at least in Italy. And instead, they're really going to encourage conversations with their community to promote and encourage that there's a more cautionary adoption, if you like. And they hinted, of course, they told us, of course, that that really this is a really quite impressive area. Impressive tools are being developed, but they can still produce some inaccuracies, and that's something to keep an eye on, based upon things like limited data. Either due to things like ChatGPT's cutoff in September 21 for data, and or the quality of it. And it's a timely reminder that technology is as good as the human putting the data into the system. The same old adage, garbage in, garbage out, right? So, so that was a cautionary tale from the TEG. They also stated that it's because of the evolution, the exponential evolution of these tools, it's really quite important that PAs continue to educate themselves on these technologies and understand the capabilities. And the other note of warning coming from the TEG is that, like crypto and blockchain, there are so many organizations trying to leverage things like ChatGPT without fully understanding it in the first instance. And the TEG noted this as a critical observation. I took the liberty of asking ChatGPT itself why accountants should use such generative AI, and it said it allows quick access to information and answers to specific accounting-related questions. It promotes enhanced productivity and streamlines process. It can act as a virtual assistant with access to experts, providing guidance and insights. And it acts as a portal for continuing education, recognizing that accountants must stay up to date with the latest changes. It also said that it supports decision-making when accountants face complex scenarios, and it provides training and mentorship for supporting young aspiring accountants. It added a little disclaimer, just as for good measure, I think. Whilst ChatGPT can be a valuable tool for accountants, it should not replace human expertise. Accountants should always exercise professional judgment and verify information obtained from ChatGPT against reliable sources, and consult with experienced professionals and experts when necessary. I think it might actually be using some of our code, and it's what it's told us. So the TEG was quite quick to state that when using these types of new technologies, that the accountability still rests with the professional accountants, just like in the use of experts, as we heard over the last couple of days too. AI such as ChatGPT can be powerful. However, PAs still need the necessary knowledge and expertise to verify the underlying information, and that the output is, of course, correct. Governance around the use of technology. The TEG was noting that, of course, the profession is quite a long way down the road with the implementation of ISQM1, but the discussions emphasize that there should be a measured approach to the adoption and use of generative AI, and it's important for organizations to have policies in place so that technologies use is approved in a methodical way in the normal course of business. So rather than banning the use of technology, PAs should be encouraged to use these tools and resources, but within a controlled environment, with the application of critical thinking being key. It was also noted that professional accountants should be careful in what is shared and what the technology is being used for. And this, of course, is to ensure confidentiality of client information and that it is maintained. On this point, I also refer to my ChatGPT assistant and to really let us know what a professional accountant should be thinking about when it uses these tools in the context of client information. And it had all the great things in there, of course. It had confidentiality, and accountants have a legal and ethical obligation to maintain the confidentiality of client information, data protection. Before accountants use an AI tool, they should review the privacy policies and terms of service to understand how the handler handles the information. Compliance and with regulations, noting that there are specific laws and regulations out there which deal with data privacy and client confidentiality. It noted that to anonymize data is important when using it. And vendor selection. Before adopting any AI tools, assess a vendor's reviews, customer testimonials, and security certifications to ensure that provider has a track record, essentially. So all these things are coming out of ChatGPT itself. So very helpful, I thought, actually, to at least help with the report back. There's also some powerful feedback from the TEG, and that is that professional accountants must embrace and accept the use of generative AI. And one of the resonant quotes that came from a TEG member was that you can't really put the genie back in the bottle, okay, once it's out. So professional accountants should really, therefore, elevate professional training and deepen their knowledge, experience, and skill sets for these types of technologies. Their warning really is, keep pace with change, because the bad actors out there are adopting here at an accelerated rate, which is exponential and seems to keep pace with technology itself. I asked ChatGPT again, must an accountant use ChatGPT and generative AI tools? And it said, like ChatGPT, can provide accountants with quick access to information, support decision-making processes, and enhance productivity. However, there should be a conscious decision based on an accountant's assessment of the benefits, limitations, and potential risks of association with these tools. So again, resonates with quite a lot of what's in our technology provisions. All right, I'd be remiss not to bring up some of the other topics that were mentioned, and one of those was artificial intelligence in the context of fraud. And the TEG told us that much has happened in this area since the last time that the TEG and the TWG has met, and there is a real concern that we may see a wave of financial statement fraud in the context of this rapid development and adoption of artificial intelligence. And that's really without a historical basis and practical learning in the context of AI, and they could catch us off guard. I think what we might do is a technology working group is focus on this topic for one of our future educational pieces. Blockchain, as you would expect, did come up. It's almost inevitable. And the upshot from the discussion, there are many technologies that are still not as well understood, including blockchain, and by most people, but including professional accountants. And the TEG also discussed that in the context of auditor independence, when auditors become part of the blockchain, being added as a node on the blockchain so that you can actually perform an audit, does that create an independence issue, or does it not? Does it create a concern? And the emerging risk, if the answer is just to not do anything, is that when firms get stuck on the answer, then clients themselves go outside the profession and deal with other service providers who are not accountable to the same ethics and independent standards. And they're starting to see trends with other third parties performing audits of blockchain. Cryptocurrencies, well, course, very closely connected to blockchain, and many professional accountants are still trying to figure out what cryptocurrencies are and how to use them, and what the ethical issues are when you're trying to address the concerns. And I think the message from the technology experts group here is that it's one thing to be able to understand the ethical implications of technology at the high level. It's another to understand the specific and more granular ethical implications at the application of the technology itself. So blockchain and crypto and smart contracts and such like. So there's a call really coming out of this for a similar amount of effort to help professional accountants understand this space a bit better, perhaps developing more supporting accounting standards, something that's out with our remit, of course. But as of today, because of this inertia, to some extent, the footprint of professional accountants in being able to deal with cryptocurrencies is still quite small. So let's move on quickly to the use of smart contracts and digital signatures. Within this domain, from the TEG of crypto, and increasingly in respect of digital assets, people are talking about smart contracts and talking about them quite a bit. And entities and players in the industry have been asking firms to help them provide audits on smart contracts. And there was a feeling that, at that point, when they asked the question, things get stuck, things get bogged down a little. And this is partly because the level of technology required to conduct the work is considerable, and partly because there's a lack of understanding which standards can be used to support the actual work. So when you have a lack of an attestation standard on one hand, a lack of criteria on the other hand, the profession is not able to function in that sense, and it's not able to embrace its role as the trusted provider in the digital asset space. And so the challenge from the TEG is, how do we really make sure that the collaboration, or that we collaborate in such a way to enable the profession to move forward and address the key issues and concerns. And accountants are essentially, their words, being left behind. And if we look at who's providing smart contract audit reports right now, many of them are not accounting firms. Few of them are Quantstamp, Open Zeppelin, Consensus, Certic, etc. So it's one to watch. On digital signatures, the technology experts group brought our attention to the regulators in this space, and one, I think it was in China, have mandated that digital signatures be used as part of the submission of audit reports to the regulator. And so whilst the firms still grapple a little bit with digital signatures, the regulatory environment is moving forward on this, and they're forging ahead. My last sort of overarching comment to make and input from the TEG is really on the sort of guiding principles. Okay, the latest technology provides, of course, is based upon guiding principles, and the TWG absolutely agree that that's the correct course of action. But it notes in the course of the discussion with the TEG, it's about the ability to take those from this sort of high level principles and sort of apply them into the application of technology space. And so the TWG has resolved to work a bit more closely with the technology experts group to work on scenarios, that can help stress test the application of the new technology provisions and see where we get to. And I think we might bring you some of that output in one of the next board sessions, either September or December, if we manage to get that bandwidth. So let me pause here momentarily. How's the time? Okay, maybe we can park questions and reactions to this on the back of Danielle's input. But let me just quickly, unless you would like to, introduce. Is that okay? So thank you, Danielle, for joining. Really appreciate it. Danielle Supkiss-Cheek is the Vice President of Strategy and Industry Relations at MindBridge AI. She's going to bring us an educational session, unless things have changed, on generative artificial intelligence, large language models, and data governance, and part of what we said we'd bring to you in the December meeting. The session will build on the introduction, of course, to ChatGPT that Laura kindly gave us in March in Abu Dhabi, and we'll discuss the nuances of ethical considerations regarding the use of AI, the practical uses of AI, and how the human element must coexist and cohabit in this space. Danielle, over to you.
Thank you
so
very much
for joining.
Oh, thank you for having me. And thank you for a great introduction and kind of explanatory remarks at the beginning, because that will make us keep some quick pace and leave plenty of time for questions. Just a quick disclaimer that I'm here to present my own personal opinions, so blame me for my opinions. Please don't blame the others that I work with, including the Auditing Standards Board. Just a quick level set on artificial intelligence, because it's such a broad topic. Even just the definition of what is artificial intelligence is actually an area of debate. And I usually go with the 1955 definition from McCarthy, that is the science and engineering of making intelligent machines. And there's two different categories of broad artificial intelligence, and the concept of weak AI and strong AI. Weak AI is all these narrow scope applications that we've talked about, that you've talked about today. Stuff like Google Translate and that augmented reality where it'll tell you what the menu says in a different language. The Boston Dynamics robots that are dancing, and even just unlocking your phone with your face. Strong AI is the stuff that a lot of people are worried about of this robot uprising. And I actually am not aware of any commercial application of it. Maybe some government agency behind the scenes has something related to this. But in the world of AI, it may actually never exist because of the EU AI Act regulations. I'll cover that in a little bit, but they break AI into 3 different categories that we'll have to be watching in the future for what comes next. And the whole point of AI is really to help humans. It is not in a concept to replace humans, but rather help identify what humans should be paying attention to and enable them. And it's really because the information age is old news at this point. There's so much information out there, we couldn't possibly ever keep up. And we're now in a conceptual age that's related to curation. And so the concepts of generative AI will help you curate a vast amount of information. And there's other areas in AI that help you curate that information as well. So for example, I think we probably can all agree that there's a transparency wave expectation. That's probably the foundation of the expectation gap. That's probably the foundation of a lot of ESG needs in reporting. And that expectation gap in capital markets means the concept of what is knowable and the expectation for what to be known is really changing. When you have hindsight and you can go back into a data set and find whatever it is you're specific looking for, the data is probably there, it exists. But how do you handle those needs in real time before you have the benefit of hindsight? And that's why you hear so much about AI coming into the accounting profession, not just from the generative AI process of large language models, but other types of AI technology as well in order to analyze data sets. So one of the most important concepts in the entire field of AI is something called human in the loop. That is the concept that humans need to be involved at every step of the way and work alongside of AI. You'll hear me talk about in a second that the trend right now is to treat AI as a coworker. So let's pretend AI is in effect a first-year staff. That's the concept of you would still review their work. You'd still review a first-year staff work. But you're never, in effect, delegating your responsibilities to a machine and not being able to supervise it. By the way, that art on the screen is from DALL-E, which is the sister to ChatGPT from OpenAI as their generative art. Just if you hadn't seen generative art yet. What makes AI so hard to kind of get our hands around from the world of accounting is there's so many different components of AI that fit in the space. We're going to be talking today about machine learning. That's in the world of generative AI, and anomaly detection concepts fit here as well. But generative AI that has even the foundation models. And what a foundation model is instead of doing one small data set to do something really specific, a very, very, very vast and large data set, such as the data set that whatever ChatGPT used, is available. And then you can do specific use cases off those different things. They're also working on different foundational models that can be used for vision or code, and they're kind of broad knowledge bases that are loaded. The great part about that is you get some different kind of performance benefits and productivity, but it does come at a cost related to computational power and some trust issues because you don't necessarily know what's in there. And what's really interesting is that then that puts us into the world of other parts of AI related to something like natural language processing, which is that generation of text that sounds very human in nature. And your last presentation explained it very well. If it's predicting the next word that would make the most sense. Now, in the world of machine learning, there's some scary words in here. And nobody in the field of data science really consulted me, because why would they? It predates me, of how they named a lot of their different types of technology. If we all remember the term unqualified opinion and how confusing that was to a non-accountant and even some accountants or auditors. So not an unqualified opinion, a lay person thought that meant that the public accountant was not qualified to issue that opinion, versus what it meant to mean was that the opinion did not have an additional qualifier to it. That was very confusing in the world of lay people, and again, still to accountants. The same thing happens in the world of data science. It's a different language. There's terms called supervised learning and unsupervised learning. My guess is that many of y'all will actually think that supervised learning is probably better just because it has the word supervised versus unsupervised. Unsupervised, usually people think about nobody's minding the shop, the humans aren't involved, and it's just going on a rampage and doing whatever it wants. That's probably, if I could see faces, I'd probably see some nodding heads for that. However, what it's talking about is where there's a supervision, not the whole overall concept of human in the loop, but rather in different parts of the model. So a supervised machine learning concept means that there's some kind of supervision of categories, tags, or something like that. So let's use the cat picture example, even though I realize that's not a great accounting example. We already preloaded everything and said, this is my population of cat pictures. The model then figures out, all those pictures, the similarity is they all have pointy ears. Therefore, I know if it has pointy ears, it has a high probability of being cat. Versus an unsupervised learning model doesn't have that pre-category or tagging. In that example, you would have a bunch of cat pictures that you did not tell something was a cat, and the machine has no knowledge of what that may be, but it says, I'm going to group all the pictures on whatever characteristics I think is the most interesting. And it seems to be that there's a good predictive similarity between something that has pointy ears and these are the ones that have floppy ears. And it'll break apart and say, these are pointy ear pictures. These are floppy ear pictures. It has no idea that pointy ears means cat. It just knows that all these have a similarity and are grouped because of pointy ears. So the concept of where do you inject human bias into your model is actually very much based on this concept of supervised versus unsupervised machine learning. Typically, you actually inject the most risk of bias in the world of supervised machine learning versus unsupervised. You're in effect just breaking things into categories and then letting the humans review the output and then make the determination that therefore they are cat pictures. There's also a hybrid concept called reinforcement learning. That one can get a little scary in the world of accounting just because in the learning process, so that would be the concept of I find everything that's pointy ears in a different category from floppy ears, and then I flag it as pointy ears means cat. I give it a category as the human, and then the model starts to iterate and learn, okay, in the future, I should name anything with a pointy ears a cat. And so where you inject human bias into those models can be a little tricky. So the point of this slide is to really make sure you're understanding the nature of the underlying technology that is being used and where do those human biases that can be perpetrated throughout the entire analysis that you may be doing or work you may be doing, where those come in and maybe where they are less likely to come in. So today's example is going to be a little case study where we're going to have ChatGPT draft a first draft of work papers and go through the 5 principles and figure out what can we actually do today under the current code, as well as what's coming with the changes from the technology updates of how we could actually execute this today. So this is the ChatGPT response for writing an audit work paper that has all the cache assertions with no findings and lists kind of the testing and put it in a tabular format. If anybody didn't know, you can actually tell ChatGPT what format to put things in, and it'll nicely lay that out for you. Same thing for if anybody hasn't seen other generative AI models. Here's Google Bard's response. And so there's just more competitors out there to ChatGPT. Now, I've included in your slides, but there's already been a lot of coverage on this. So this is mainly, we're going to skip these very quickly. And if you need these, there are referenced in your deck. But I did ask ChatGPT a couple of things about itself and about IESBA. And so you can read those at your leisure if you'd like to. One thing I really want to make sure we're noting is that David already brought it up. September 2021 is our cutoff date in ChatGPT. I did ask the same question to Google Bard. I don't know if everybody has access to Google Bard, so I'll stop there for a second. This one actually is a little bit more updated, and it does provide you links to source files. ChatGPT doesn't actually provide those links, so that's a nice little benefit there. So that's all fine and dandy. That's great. We've seen great, cool examples, but what does that actually mean? So what are those ethical requirements when you rely on a staff? It's all of them. And what are the ethical requirements when you rely upon AI? It's, again, all of them. Think of the concept of AI as a coworker. Now, I believe an earlier draft of this had the bottom that didn't have the doesn't release your responsibility. So I may have had a typo in a draft. Clearly, you have these ethical responsibilities. And what's really great about the technology updates that have already been made and coming out or becoming effective soon is that the concept of handling the output of a technology similar to the reliance upon an expert is actually a very elegant approach to this, especially if you think of it as a coworker. And the same concept of what I'd have to rely upon a coworker or an expert, I need to be able to rely upon from that output of the AI. So getting right into integrity first. One of the first things that people don't quite fully realize is that there's actually a citation or attribution policy to ChatGPT and OpenAI. It's technically OpenAI. You're allowed to use their content for commercial purposes like what we've done, but it actually says you're supposed to acknowledge that it's being the generation of AI and not a human originated concept. They give you they give you some example wording. In our policy, we have standardized wording that we use anytime we are using an acknowledgement there. One of the funny things is there was like a court case in Texas where a lawyer had a brief written by ChatGPT. Turns out it was wrong. The judge got very upset about it. And now in his courtroom, you're required to cite the use of AI, that a generative AI that you've used in your model. And it just tickles me to death because that's already part of the ethical use of it, because the integrity says that you should, in effect, be transparent and not misleading with your information that you're providing in your communications. So one to always watch out for. One of the tricks in this is if we are the staff using this in our work papers. So it's not plagiarism if we cite it appropriately according to the policy of OpenAI. Are you comfortable with your work papers having such a citation? A lot of people will say that some part of it was originated AI and has been subject to human review. This one talks about that you have to take responsibility for the output, which is fine. That is a normal CPA thing to do and an accountant thing to do. So just really focus on that ethical attribution or citation. Most people are aware that this piece exists. Okay. Objectivity. If you think about all the different biases that are brought up in our code, there's just so much here that we don't necessarily know. Clearly, the automation bias is probably the one that we need to pay attention to the most. I'll show you a really good hallucination in a second. Maybe I'll even jump to it because it's particularly funny. Yeah, let me get to my hallucination because I do enjoy this one. So I know that you've talked about hallucinations in the past. What a hallucination is, in case anybody's not familiar with it, is when ChatGPT is completely and totally wrong, but sounds super confident. It's like confidently wrong. This is about me. If you type this into a current ChatGPT iteration, it won't come up. So I was able to grab a screenshot at early stages, and it says I'm an art professor, that I was born in the 60s, which I wasn't. And I specialize in lithographs, and I've won a bunch of art awards. I don't have any relatives with similar names. This is totally wrong. So if I think about those different biases, I have that risk of relying upon an output. However, if you say, okay, we're just going to use this for a first level draft and everything has to be double checked, how is that any different than relying upon a first year staff that may not know the work that well either because they're brand new to the profession? Other biases that are tricky in this world are unknown biases related to where the model was trained and the unknown level of information going into it. However, if we do enough work on the output and the ethical requirements are related to the output of technology, we might be able to overcome a lot of these biases, but we need to be aware of them because it is a bit scary for not knowing exactly the origin of everything. Okay, moving on. Professional competence and due care. This one is really heavily tied into a lot of the concepts in ISQM 1. And one of the things that you're having to do, and David mentioned it very briefly and very well, is those vendor assessments happening at the centralized level of an organization, and the firms needing to actually vet their tools and in effect give permissible uses of tools within their own firms. Don't forget that the technology updates also apply to professional accountants in business. So that wouldn't be just the ISQM for them. They would also have the technology, or they would have just the technology ethics component, but there is a lot in there that to be able to competently supervise and put together a policy that I'm concerned that some firms that are not paying attention to this will not create a policy and instead just allow the use internally or have secret use of ChatGPT, which I think is actually more dangerous than having a permissible policy. Okay, in the code, there are actually mitigation approaches to bias that are already stated. So seeking advice from experts. So that is the concept of when do I need to bring in a data science developer or a technologist? For ChatGPT, and if the policy is we have to review every single output in a very detailed way by a subject matter expert, maybe somebody that's a senior or above, or something that is, you know, what y'all determine to be an expert of that output, of the level of input you're allowed, that may not require an additional data scientist or developer. You start looking at unsupervised machine learning, or excuse me, supervised machine learning models that are a little bit more black box. And I'll show you some examples of how you can oversight those in a second. That may require a little bit more assistance from those experts. Okay, you can also consult with others to ensure appropriate challenges are part of the evaluation process. That may be already that the review process of your binders for your engagements is enough, or whatever work papers you have if you're a professional accountant in business. The existing review process may be enough for some generative AI models. For other AI models, it may not be enough at all, and you need to do more work on the actual processing approach. And then receiving additional training related to the identification of bias as part of the professional development. That's probably a good idea, especially once you design your policies within your own organizations and actually educate people on their policies. One quick side note about ISQM 1 is a lot of times the size of the firm also dictates the centralized or decentralized nature of their methodology. And ISQM 1 has that component where you need to have vetted tools in order to allow your staff to work on them. And I'm broadly summarizing there. So anybody that knows the exact paragraph reference, you know, I've taken a lot of liberties of how I've summarized that. At the smaller firms, many times they are not used to those assessments. Once you get into the more mid-sized firms that are used to modifying methodologies that come from third-party providers, then you start to see that is a very comfortable place and they have processes in place to already deal with it. So one of the things to watch out for anybody listening is watch out. Your third-party service providers probably are not making these vettings and assessments for you. You'll need to do that. Okay, let's talk about how to actually supervise AI. There's different ways to supervise AI. And again, the nature of how to supervise AI will depend on what kind of machine learning you're using, unsupervised versus supervised machine learning. And I realize that's really tricky because I use supervise in two different ways. So the concept of the human supervision, again, is different than supervised versus unsupervised machine learning. And again, I really wish they hadn't named these this way. So first, foundational level is you always have to have third-party assurance or at least some kind of comfort on the security of the data. Table stakes, you have to have that under not just the current code of ethics, I would actually argue, but in the new code or the technology updates, it does require active approaches. Then depending on what you're doing, so if you're using algorithms, which you would if you were using unsupervised machine learning, you probably want to look at how those algorithms work. There are third-party validations of algorithms now. The one, just so you know, that we happen to use is called Holistic AI. They're based in the UK, and they're a spin-off from University College of London. A lot of organizations will do additional testing at a specific level of in effect, reperformance. So load a small data set that you can actually recalculate yourself versus the computational power of a larger system and see that you get similar results. You may not be able to get exactly the same results because the nature of how complex a calculation is versus what you're able to recreate in something like Excel, but you should get pretty similar results. Never forget to deal with the completeness of the data. That is going to be one of your most important concepts as you're then getting into a specific use case. If you load incomplete data, so input into whatever tool you're using, you're going to run into a problem that you can't rely upon the output. And one of the biggest things that I think people forget about when they're supervising any type of AI is auditor judgment is so important, or professional accountant judgment is so important. And when people find results that they find to be boring because they already knew about it, I believe that's actually proof that their approach is working because they're finding things that they know should have existed. And they should take some kind of credit of, I believe the approach is working because I am finding things that I know I should have found. And that's a concept that most people don't think about because it's considered boring and they already know about it. But to the extent that you find the boring stuff that you already know about, and then there's other things that may exist, that is a very important concept for reliability. Now, that's all relatively simple, very orderly. Once you get into the world of supervised machine learning, it can get a little bit more complex. So I've provided a couple of examples of what you could do. I'm not going to spend a ton of time explaining each one of these just because you could go out and use ChatGPT to explain these to you or search them on the web. So representative testing data sets, that's exactly what we just talked about, similar to unsupervised machine learning. It's not exactly reperformance, but if you ever hear people talking about like holding back data, it's either representative testing or this cross-validation concept. So if you like bifurcate your training data versus your results, you want to test the data for the result of the training. The color of my boxes on this screen are about how black box the technology may be. So that presumes that you can actually fairly see well of how the whatever machine learning you're working with actually works or not. Many times you will not have access to that. It doesn't mean you can't rely upon things that are black box, especially with the code of ethics saying it's about the output, which I think is the right way to consider this. The problem becomes it becomes much more difficult. So we can do different kinds of evaluation metrics in both types. You know, I sit there and look at the results and I run various like basic statistics to see, are the results meaningful and are they in line with my expectation? Are they consistent with whatever may be the case? But let's go to the far extreme on this one called flip test. In a lot of scandals outside of accounting, thank goodness this is not inside of accounting at the moment, in the world of human resources, there have been some scandals where people take machine learning and then use it to predict who will be a good applicant based on who's been a past solid performer within the organization. There may be some institutional bias within that organization that spans many generations or decades of what used to be the place. It may also be adverse to some of the new DEI initiatives that an organization may have because they are working to change some of what may have been in the past. And so if you look at all those past indicators, there was a scandal here in the US where it was determined that if somebody had played lacrosse at an Ivy League school, that was the best predictor of them being able to be good at their job, which I bet we can mostly agree that that's probably not the best indicator of if somebody is going to be a solid worker at their job. Maybe is one, but probably not the best one. So even in really unclear technologies, you can do something called a flip test, where if you have something that should not be related at all to the outcome, well, maybe one, you don't include that data in the first place, but two, can you switch that characteristic and have no change to the result? So let's say somebody's part of a protected class and you want to see, does that protected class have an impact on the end result? Because maybe in this scenario, it shouldn't. Change them from a protected class to an unprotected or vice versa, whichever may be the way you're trying to test, and see, does that change your output? You can do those kinds of things also in generative AI models, but don't forget that since a lot of these models are learning and getting more powerful, these are constant things that you'd have to test and retest to see, are they working? And again, this is how to oversight a little bit more of the processing. If you're going down an approach of relying upon first copywriting of a first draft of a work paper, going back to your review of the output through somebody that's an expert in that area, so maybe a senior or a manager, because they should know your cash assertions on that engagement, that may be good enough, and you don't have to understand the exact nuance of how something works because you heavily supervise the output of technology. Now, I did mention that I would bring up the EU AI Act. I personally believe this is going to be the next GDPR and prevent some of the really scary AI RoboCop, robot uprising kinds of concepts. There's 3 different categories of AI in the EU AI Act. First is the unacceptable risk AI. That is the robot uprising, taking over the human experience, putting the human race into extinction type of concepts. Then there's high risk. That becomes those that have the impact to significantly augment the human experience. So my ability to access banking, let's say AI was used to determine if I can get a home loan and what interest rate I would get. That would be high risk because if I can't make it through the AI model, I no longer have access to some of the banking world. And if I can't have access to the banking world, I can't really coexist within having financing, getting a house, and all those different things. That would be high risk. And then low risk is the kind of everything else. It's nice. This is probably where generative art would fit. So your DALL-E and Midjourney, where there's a lot of people that would argue that art is essential to the human experience. I agree with you, but it doesn't mean that if I can't use generative AI art, that I cannot exist in this world. So watch for that. It hasn't been finalized yet. It's been through several rounds. But something to majorly watch out for, especially for whatever interplay there may be with NOPLAR in the future. Okay, let's keep it going. I also want to always put a plug in for good project management is a quality indicator. I know this is not the IESBA, but I do like to always put this in. Because if you are thinking about using ChatGPT for work papers, as this case study would be an example of, being able to get those reviews in early and finding if you have issues early on in the engagement process will improve your quality. Finding things earlier, in my personal opinion, does improve your quality. Also, to the extent you use AI in other aspects of your engagements, or your work product, if you're a PAIB, finding something earlier gives you more options of how to deal with it. And that's why you see a lot of people looking toward AI in order to help them, let's go back to this slide, help them curate content so that they can be more enabled to do their job and be more relevant. So just a little shameless plug there for project management. Okay, confidentiality is probably the biggest one, and we're getting close to the end, so there will be plenty of time for questions. David brought it up perfectly that we don't necessarily know what the data in ChatGPT or other large language models, where it goes and what is done with it. The current requirement is an inadvertent disclosure concept. The coming requirement for the technology updates is you have to take appropriate action to protect the confidentiality. This is where I believe that if you don't have, this is Danielle's personal opinion, let's just make that very clear. If you are not looking at creating a ChatGPT or large language model or foundational model policy, and you have knowledge that your staff are using it, you could run into trouble. Now, it could be a very simple policy that you need to say of thou shalt not put client confidential information or any confidential information into a large language model. And that may be enough for your organization, but maybe rely upon like supervise the outputs. That may be enough. Those two ends may be enough for your policy. But with the coming requirement, if you are burying your head in the sand, I think you're going to run into trouble because of that appropriate action concept. I will let each organization determine clearly, because it's their determination of what's appropriate for their firms. A lot of firms, in order to get and deal with this situation, are just outright banning the use of ChatGPT and other large language models. That's all fine and dandy. But if you then find out and have knowledge of people using personal computers or personal accounts and emailing themselves or whatever may be the case to bypass your locking out, you may still have this kind of risk because you can't control everything. You can probably control what's on your network, which is good, but what is considered an appropriate action? I do recall on the March presentation, somebody, and I forgot who it was, asked a question about what about in universities and the cheating in universities and information going in on that. So a little side note there is I also teach in university, and what I've been doing is full permissibility of the use of OpenAI or large language models in my class, and I make people present to me what is their opinion of which way. So if they use ChatGPT, they could get a nice little write-up, but it will not take care of which way should they pick. So I make everything be, they should pick which way something should go. They have to take a position and then defend that position. So very much like a debate class concept. And the question was also about the ethics of examinations within firms. And, you know, firms could start to do these kinds of concepts where you change your approach to making people develop in your training exercises the thought leadership, or the thought skills to be able to, how do I assess the information that's being provided to me and then make a determination of which way is right. So a little aside, and I'll bring it right back to what is the privacy policy of OpenAI. If you go through, and this is a hyperlink if you download the deck, OpenAI is allowed to do a lot with your information, a lot. And that's pretty scary. We also don't necessarily know what they do with it, how it reinforces what models they may have, and what they may do with it in the future. So I think most people are taking a very strong stance of no confidential information is allowed to go into a public model, foundational model. Now, the difference becomes now organizations are looking at creating private models, generative AI, that is only through their components of stuff that they're allowed to do. If somebody has, and you have the ability to oversight the appropriate data confidentiality, remember that slide where I said that security of the data, and I'll go back to it briefly, the security of the data is your foundational layer. That's what you have to have in place. It doesn't have to necessarily be these particular certifications, but you have to do something to validate and feel comfortable that your data is secure. Those might be situations where you can put in confidential data. I know some of the large legal research providers are putting in GPT-like models and foundational models. One of the tricks is a foundational model, the whole concept is it has a large and broad base for which to call on and to learn from and to be able to make that next prediction. So those may be becoming complex in order to execute, to be able to have enough information to get that good prediction. Now, the other reason that this is so hard is that data governance is already hard. But then when you add data governance within an organization that has to deal with data from multiple different organizations. So data governance at a company, hard. Data governance at an audit firm, even harder, because you have to deal with the data governance of each of your underlying clients. And most people know of the concept of where data resides matters, but doesn't know that necessarily the term of data residency. I did ask ChatGPT to give us a little snippet of what does data residency mean. And it means, and this is where it gets tricky, is because it's in the cloud. Well, it has to be on a server that has to physically be somewhere, and that where that server is really matters. Those of you that may work with different various government contracts, you probably are very well aware of this, and they have really strict requirements. Also, most major providers like a Microsoft Azure will allow you to pick which physical location you put the data in. But you also have to remember, it's not just about the primary data. It's also about your redundancy, your hot or cold storage, your backups, whatever may be your fail-safe plan for that data. You need to have the data residency for both in the jurisdiction you need to have. So just a really big hit there. Here, and the reason this matters is because just here's the 5 largest economies and what the government is allowed to access of private company data. If you ask ChatGPT, where is their data stored? They say mostly in the US. That may be okay for many, but that may not be good enough for a lot of others. Mostly in the US is not all in the US. And is my stuff the stuff that's in the US, or is my stuff the stuff that may be in a server of an unknown location with an unknown government organization that's allowed to access my data? That can be a very scary prospect for a lot of organizations. You'll also see that a lot of organizations and firms will start to develop something called a data strategy. I see kind of data strategies at the solid middle market size firms that have industry specializations, heavy industry specializations, have the most centralized data strategy for the underlying like accounting data. The requirements of data security are clearly the highest at the biggest of the organizations, but kind of centralized systematic similarities in like all the data does these different things. The biggest firms have a lot of that as well. But what ends up happening is that they have so many really complex organizations that they may audit that they actually have to, they can't centralize, over-centralize on the actual underlying data. Clearly, their data security is really focused. But that underlying piece, there's so many differences, they don't get the benefit of having some of that centralized data strategy where they can create some automation off of it. Okay, I believe we're on our final section. Professional behavior. Don't forget that we have to act professionally and in response to the public interest and follow all relevant laws and regulations. David already mentioned it, ChatGPT was banned in Italy. What does that mean for following the different laws? That can be a little bit scary for those of you that may be in Italy, but does that extend if your client has operations in Italy? I do not know the answer to that. So something just to watch in the future as different things and different laws. Also, really pay attention to what happens with the EU AI Act. This could really get interesting on what is the use of AI. So in short, is this okay today? I'll let y'all discuss because we're about to open up for questions. I think each firm is going to have to make this determination, but I think you can be solidly within the ethical framework of today and tomorrow by permitting this, as long as you have the right safeguards in place. One of the things to always watch out for is certain, especially if you're a PAIB in business, is on the export. Watch out for concepts related to if you allow the export of code and let's say you say, have it write an Excel macro for me. One of the tricks that you may have there is there malicious code into that export or that copy and paste? Also, to the extent that you are doing anything that's really sensitive from a IP perspective, OpenAI does give you that, that ability to, and I'll go back to it for a second, use their work or their output in this sharing and publication policy. But to the extent that there's underlying IP that they do not have the ability to give you that right and gave you the right anyway, even though they don't really have it, and it's actually somebody else's IP that you don't happen to know of, you might have an IP infringement on certain things that are really specialized in your organization that you may not realize. So just another risk to take into consideration. So with that, I'm right at time. There's a couple other change management things if anybody wants some change management resources. But with that, I'll just turn it over to questions. There's no questions.
Thank you very
I'll talk about
much.
change management.
No, I think that there will be some. Thank you very much, Danielle, for this fascinating presentation. I must say that even if I'm not the most skilled person on technology-related issues, this was really fascinating from an intellectual point of view first. And there were some moments here where there were, I think it was very informative, educational, but also thought-provoking, and I felt myself very much provoked in along your over the presentation, and even with the initial presentation of from David, who is not disconnected from what we heard from you. Thank you very much for that. This is really really fascinating. I might have a few things to comment on, but I'll leave the floor to the board members first, and then we'll see where it brings us. And I see Andy, and I saw your face during the presentation many times. You are, so please, the floor is yours.
Hey, Danielle, and Andy Mensa here. It was good to see you in the real world in Washington, but we meet again over Zoom. Absolutely, thank you for tying together our fundamental principles with ChatGPT. That was really spot on, and it brought home a lot of points. You had raised that issue about the lawyers in Texas getting in trouble. So it sounds like a joke. Have you heard the one about the lawyers appearing in New York just a week ago with Avianca Airlines, where the lawyer wrote a brief, and ChatGPT wrote a brief, and it cited 6 court cases, and all 6 court cases were hallucinations. They never existed, and the lawyer hadn't looked them up or verified them, and so it's a big. I don't think the ruling as to what his punishment is has yet come out, but the hearing was last week.
And the articles about that one were particularly scary because he said he didn't know it could be wrong. That's
the New York Times described.
Yeah,
the New York Times described it as a cringeworthy hearing. So anyway, that's just a fascinating one to add to the list of because I could see that for an accountant or someone in business using that to write a report or support for a work paper or an assertion, and not understanding that it could be an hallucination. And that was a word, by the way, I just learned last week for the first time, the AI hallucination. So thanks for sensitizing us to that.
I may add to this too, is that when you supervise and then have the different attribution, I only put the OpenAI's policy. Each model or a service provider may have a different attribution requirement. So when you do create a policy, you'll probably need to assess which ones you permit and what is your requirements related to that. So you may have to have one of these policies that is updating in real time. And you know how you have at the end, like, these are the vendors we've assessed, and these are the permissible use cases for this particular vendor. So I just wanted to bring that piece up because that can scare a lot of people of what attribution, and am I willing to have that? Otherwise, if you don't have it and you're in violation of the terms and conditions, you know, how big of an integrity issue is that?
Thank you, Andy and Danielle. Other comments or questions? Chana, please.
Thanks, David and Daniel, for your presentations. I just have an observation, and it's something for the working group to keep eye on. I mean, the technology provisions don't become effective till the end of 2024. And so does that create a risk that it could become out of date by the time it needs to start being operational? So something for the working group to keep eye on in the next 18 months or so.
I'll add my personal comment to that. So again, this is very much a personal matter. Most of the concepts, particularly the concept of being able to rely upon the output and the principles that were designed, should be fairly evergreen. You know, clearly, I agree with you that we don't know what's going to happen in the next 18 months, and we could be completely disrupted again. But most of that project was in order to be able to not predict what technology would be there and be able to still be efficacious and relevant. But that's just my personal opinion. So I'll let others provide feedback if you need to, particularly David.
Thanks, Danielle. And Jana, the point is noted. And I think this is probably what we're trying to achieve in the next round of engagement with the TEG, is to see where we are with those technology provisions, if they are still stress testable in the environment that we've got right now after the advent of course, ChatGPT in November, and where we are today, which is not where we were in November, right? So I think we will take that on board and closely look at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jana and David. More questions? Sadia, please.
Thank you for your presentation. It was very informative, and I always love learning new things on these when you get interactive with them. I was taken aback that you mentioned the word expert a couple of times, and we have an experts task group that we're currently working on. I wanted to know if you would indulge us and predict if in time we could consider AI as an expert like we do a human, and whether any of those findings that you have a different response if you go and subscribe to it. So ChatGPT has a paywall, and if you subscribe, do you get different results, and do the hallucinations get less?
So great question. The world of AI actually already has something called expert systems. That is already a term that exists today in the world. It's the example that we have that's best relevant to accounting is that say an accountant knows that when you pair depreciation and cash in the same journal entry, that probably shouldn't happen except for on the most rarest of mid-month disposals that you'd have a depreciation and a cash in the same journal entry. And so taking some of those expert rules that are embodied in the knowledge base of somebody that knows a field of study very well, and being able to apply those rules to vast data sets and be able to predict, is this problematic or not, already exists today. That you can commercially buy that concept as of today. So I believe we're already there, but I don't think that changes the way that you would it may change the how you supervise it and what experts you have to bring in to assess. Do we assess every single rule and see if we concur with those, or do we assess the output related to it? Expert systems are actually a little bit easier to supervise because they're usually a list of rules. And if I supervise that list of rules that went in with my own expert, then I may be in a good place. But let's say I can't, well, then I could look at a training data set or a sample data set or a recalculation where I feed it something that has depreciation in cash and see, does it flag it? So great question, but I think the standards will hold for that. And a lot of the terms that I was using in expert were not meant to be any of the projects related to reliance on experts, but more so the similarities and analogies that the Code of Ethics has put into supervising the output, similar to the way you supervise the result of the work of an expert. So more of an analogous concept. But again, I go back to, I really like that concept because as AI as a coworker or human in the loop, the humans always need to be supervising that work. And I think that analogy actually works out fairly well and should stand the test of time.
Thank you very much, Danielle. Other comments? Jens, please.
Thank you very much for this very, very enlightening information sharing. I just would like to ask, you mentioned the European AI Act and the developments around that. Do you see other jurisdictions going in a similar direction, or do you see a trend or a global mega trend in the extreme? You mentioned Italy, that they temporarily banned it, and other jurisdictions that have nothing. What is your perception on that? Thank you.
Great question. I think EU AI Act is probably the furthest along. I think there's various smaller jurisdictions that are making statements But before that, most of the time it was the software providers that were making like the Montreal Declaration. Like they would make these ethical statements that we will follow these ethical development of AI principles. I haven't heard of a ton of very broad-based, large-scale regulation. I've mostly heard about very narrow scope AI regulation, and nothing I've heard of besides just an outright ban on something is as mature in its process on the regulatory stage as the EU AI Act. I would happen to guess that many other jurisdictions and regulators are probably looking to see what the EU AI Act does because it's so far along. And my guess is there'll be a lot of people that follow on those heels, but that's a personal guess. I'm not aware of anything else that's as big or as mature, even though it's not out yet.
Thank you, Jens and Danielle. Paul.
Danielle, thanks so much for the excellent presentation. I think one of the running points you kept flagging is the critical importance of an appropriate policy. Even if you don't get it, how do you make sure your policy is able to evolve, create a conducive environment for those realities?
Yep.
Maybe just your perspectives on, even as we look at the way forward, how much, when we look at the pillars around objectivity and integrity, do we need to start stressing the critical importance of policy on inputs and the analysis of those inputs? Just your perspectives, thanks.
Absolutely wonderful question. One of the big trends, and I think this is on the IESB's mega trends maturity curve, and I think so, but I'm only like 80% sure, is a concept called policy as code. And what that is very broadly stating is, do we all remember when expense report systems at companies went from Excel-based, I fill out all my templates, and then if I have like, let's say I have a flight policy of over 600, I must get additional approval. That happens usually at the back end through the different just general approval processes as I'm emailing or even walking a stack of paper with receipts taped to a piece of paper after it. Versus you move into one of these electronic systems that you can't even submit the expense report until you handle the exception. And so the concept as policy as code is moving us down a path where we have all of our stuff that was detective issues. We now put those requirements in as an early stage prevention matter. So I realize that's not exactly what you asked, but to me, the ability to generate policies that create consistency within how my teams are to operate, I think is going to be personally paramount, because otherwise, how do you even comply with ISQM1 if you are subject to ISQM1 on some of these concepts where you do need to have a lot of that stuff? The documentation requirement may be different on the scalability side. So policy may be just an email notice and you keep that email notice. So different documentation for different scalability concepts. But I would say lacking of policy will probably start to create issues with reasonable actions on that safeguarding client confidential information and other areas in the future. Great question. But again, personal opinion, but I would watch what happens in the world as policy as code in the world that's more in the commercial enterprise world than in the accounting world or the auditor world, I should say.
Thank you, Paul and Danielle. Hector, please.
Hi, Danielle. Thank you for the presentation. It was really illuminating, especially for somebody like me that doesn't know much about this topic. And after so many good questions, I want to pose a mediocre one. What about if I have followed the development of this, these systems are information providers. They are helping you find information. But what about judgment making? What about compliance verification? What about telling you this meets the standard, this does not meet the standard? Is that something that is being used and developed as well, as much as writing a briefing?
It is a profoundly good question, actually. That is not a mediocre question. I'm actually reading a book right now that is pretty much all about this, and it's the economics of AI. In the past, our human intellect would conflate the likelihood of something happening with our judgment call of what to do about it. We would completely conflate that concept of prediction versus that concept of judgment. And in the world of AI, right now, what we are talking about is most of the AI is on predictive power. So let's use the large language model example. We are in effect based on our large volume of knowledge and some of the past work we've done where people say it's good or bad, we are predicting what should be the next word. To make a judgment from that, I think will probably remain many times a human intellect concept. I think there'll probably be systems, so let's go futuristic for a second. There'll probably be systems in the future that may make recommendations related to judgment that will probably be very code-based, that are very like, if the prediction is this, therefore the judgment call should be these like logical steps. But so I agree with you that that could be the case. But that's the case where we start to have to worry about taking over the human experience of what to do about it. So for example, like in an auditor position, let's say we find something that is cash and depreciation, like on that expert system question that came up earlier. What should we do about that? The prediction would be that that expert system said that is likely to not be a normal journal entry. That's weird. You should probably, that's what it said. Then the judgment would be, you should probably look at it. And maybe something about how it came to be. And so I think you'll probably see some systems that are about judgment going into it as you take over larger scale concepts of how do you integrate AI into a workflow and go from just being a point solution to an entire system-based concept of redesigning systems, and how do you use the power of that prediction capability of AI in your human judgments. But I think the area that the thing we really need to watch is making sure that whatever logic was coded in for that judgment is still supervised by the human on the output side to make sure it is a good judgment call. And to the extent that there may be a multitude of different judgments given different ranges of, let's call it, probability of something to happen or not happen. Great question. Hopefully I answered it well enough. That's a really hard one to answer, actually.
Thank you, Hector and Daniel. Vania, please.
Thank you, Daniel. Very interesting presentation, but very scary as well, because it's amazing the velocity of change in terms of ChatGPT, for example. So how can we, from a generation where technology was not so intense, how do we keep in pace with that? How can we be able to follow this change and be aware of the risk for our profession and for the ethical side? You mentioned the necessity of identifying whenever you are using tests generated by artificial intelligence, but if it was truly applicable, we won't have so many problems in universities with students, for example, using the tool in order to fraud exams. How do we do with that?
Great question. I told you I had some change management slides that I skipped over, so I'm going to pull those up just briefly to talk about a couple principles. First is, there's a design principle called most advanced yet acceptable, MAYA, which is all about, you want to be forward, but you don't want to be so forward that you lack the ability to be adopted and scary. So for example, if I were to wear something like a Google Glasses into a restroom, people would probably freak out and think I'm recording them at all times. But if I walk in with my phone, kind of like this, like I'm texting and walking, that seems normal to most people. And even if I was recording, they probably wouldn't realize I'm recording, and it doesn't seem out of place. So I'd say, you know, one is keeping up with trends is very difficult. But there's a lot of people and a lot of sources and just keeping up with what's happening in the news many times will give you what those trends are. And, you know, hanging out with, let's call them the youngsters within organizations, or those that are very overly tech loving, because there's usually within an organization somebody that is overly tech loving, but walking it back to figure out, okay, I get that that's super cool and that's super cutting edge, but we need to walk it back for, if we're going to use it in our world, to be something that's actually achievable within the organization and acceptable. And I will also say that one of the things that accountants are always afraid of is the concept of change. People have said that accountants aren't good at change. But if you look at what we're really good at, is we are actually very good at having change forced upon us and changing out a tax code every year by whatever jurisdictions we're subject to, or the different standards, and changing, ripping and replacing standards is a really big deal in the accounting and audit space as well. So if we can start getting in, looking into what are the viable products and technologies that are coming, and there are a lot of organizations that do track what are the coming technologies, and being ready and kind of open of, is it worth going through and looking at what is going to be relevant for me to start to look at, mainly from an efficiency standpoint. So there's a lot of really cool stuff out there, but a lot of it is a lot of noise. Like, for example, digital twins is really cool in the concept of you recreate, it's in effect a simulator is the short way to do it. So you recreate something digitally, and then you can actually run different simulations and how things work. You're probably not going to see that in a lot of audit technology at the onset, probably pretty cool. You may be used in a lot of organizational efficiency from an operation standpoint in industry and organizations, business and industry. But does that also change your ability to audit estimates? Because they have that digital twin, and you may be able to run scenarios that the auditors can then look at how management's estimates can be tracked. So to me, it's about a willingness to pay attention to what's in the news. I'm a big fan of, I spend my morning reading the kind of accounting news of the day. And then as I see something trending, I start paying a little bit more attention to it. Also, a lot of people, like the IESB has this mega trends slope of where different technologies are for when they should start paying attention to them as they become more mature. Clearly, a lot of people are overwhelmed in the industry, so I use it as more of my current events update as well, so that I'm keeping up. And if to the extent you also have kind of tech loving individuals within your organization, that could also be a way to engage those professionals and leverage them to be like, hey, when something starts to seeing a practical application, please come to me with the practical applications. Cool, shiny objects, that's great. You enjoy your shiny objects. When you see a practical application that will have whatever benchmarks that you want to see in place in order to start assessing it, then that's when, you know, that somebody would bring it to you. And you could probably create some organizational information flows to help you filter through what may be noise of shiny objects that are not quite ready in the maturity cycle to be brought into something as important as auditing and accounting.
Thank you very much, Daniel. David.
Thanks, Gabriella, and good question. Vanya, I guess we'll do what we can to bring you more education along the way as well, and that being part of our terms of reference. And you mentioned scary, and one of my observations, which I guess is in the bucket of scary, is that, you know, there's a lot of focus, I think, on professional accountants, and rightly so, for when they use technology, they use experts, as we heard yesterday as well, that we take responsibility at the end of the day. But what I'm seeing is a disparity between that and what these vendors are doing themselves in writing in disclaimers and what have you, to absolutely release themselves from responsibility in respect of their tools and what they garner. I don't know if there's any observations you have on that as well, Danielle. That'd be helpful. Thanks.
It's a really great question. I think there's going to be a certain amount of trust that has to come out of the vendors that I think actually the accounting position is well positioned to help be part of that and to create different kinds of assurance to provide that. I think you're going to always have a lot of those disclaimers because the provider of the tool cannot control how you use it. And so it's going to be, the tool should not be taking over the human experience. And so I think some of those disclaimers are going to link to that. You could actually use a tool for bad, and I can't control if you use it for bad if I'm a tool provider. So those disclaimers are probably there for that perspective. But taking into, okay, we have to take responsibility as a profession to use a tool in the right way and properly supervise it. but I think it's going to be incumbent on vendors to be able to provide you enough level of comfort to get beyond the, well, you could use my tool for bad. But here's what we've done to give you proof that we have good data security and confidentiality. Here's our proof that we've had somebody come in and look to make sure that if we say A plus B plus C, that our calculation behind the scene really is A plus B plus C. So I think it's going to be a give and take and almost a negotiation with some vendors. I think there may be some vendors that you pretty much have to walk away from if they won't comply, and kind of vote with your feet a little bit, which would be probably upsetting for many. But there's probably also a lot of vendors that would be very forthcoming because they are aware of the ethical requirements within this industry and are willing to do what it takes in order to get many of your businesses because they would like to work in this profession. So I think there's going to be a negotiation process in those terms and conditions. And if anybody's not reading terms and conditions of software, I know it's painful to read those, but at the centralized office or national office or wherever you may determine which tools in your vendor selection process, you probably do need to be reading those terms and conditions. And I realize that becomes more difficult from a scalability perspective for the smaller firms to be able to navigate those, for sure. Great question.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I don't see anyone else wanting to make questions or comments. But on my side, very quickly, Daniel, thank you very much again for this fascinating presentation, and thank you, David, for providing us with this great opportunity. I'm really provoked by this presentation, and again, from an intellectual point of view and from a practical point of view. But I think that there are some takeaways which are absolutely clear. One is not a takeaway from this presentation, but from the reality. We spoke about prohibitions, some jurisdictions and regulators who are going down the route of prohibiting, and we know this won't work. It never worked before. It won't work because this is the reality with which we have to deal. So of course it can be regulated, mitigate the risks, etc. But prohibiting the artificial intelligence, like any other technological development, it's not possible. So the sooner we understand that and take action, the better for everybody. But of course, regulators and legislators are always slower than the reality, and in these areas much more, because before taking action, at least we hope, with a capital H, they have to understand this reality, which, as we know, is extremely difficult. So we've seen it in capital markets, we see it here, and the regulation and legislation will be slower than the reality. And so I think that we are really developing from, there was a slide which was extremely interesting with this development at the last phase from the information age into the conceptual age. And I think that we are really here in the middle of this trajectory, trying to understand how to deal with a new approach. Effectively, the information age, I think we are still there. We are flooded of information. These artificial intelligence tools provide us with amounts of information which really need a critical approach, and that's where I'd like to highlight something which I think it's of particular interest for us, which is as we move into this conceptual age with a wider need to take the whole information and reality on board, things like critical mindset, professional competence, due care, skepticism, critical mindset become absolutely critical and necessary to make sure that we make the best out of this access to so much information. The word frightening was mentioned here many times by David, by you, Daniel, by Vania, by many people. I prefer being more optimistic, of course, an informed optimist, and after this presentation, much more informed than I was before. But understanding the risks also will allow us to take all these opportunities. And it's no use thinking that this will replace accountants or people or whatever, because what it will replace is where accountants and other professionals will be focused. And it also calls us to think about other ways of performing this activity. So thank you very much for this fascinating discussion and presentation.
Thank you for having me.
And we will break now. Thank you, Danielle. We will break now for lunch, not for lunch, for lunch. So we will break for 20 minutes, or can we make it?
I think there was one remaining piece of terms of reference, David. I don't know if you want, we take it as sort of read. How do you want to?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I mean,
touch on this?
So there were no comments after we presented those, and they were a reference material as well. But I mean, any comments, we'll happily receive them now. But otherwise, we'll assume that they're agreed for going forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So we'll break now for 20 minutes.
20 minutes. So we'll be back at 10 past.
So welcome back. We are still missing a couple of people around the table, but I think we should make a start because we are already a bit late on schedule and still have a few important things to go through this morning and early this afternoon. First of all, thank you, Laurie, for joining us virtually. Welcome back as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
And this next item of the agenda, on this next item of the agenda, we will see what the working groups were able to do with the comments, the good comments of the board, with respect to going back to the proposals and making some adjustments and amendments in light of the board's suggestions and comments. Thank you very much once again. I said it yesterday, but I will repeat, for preparing for this turnaround proposed documents and slides so quickly and in the middle of so many other things to do. And with this, Mark, I'm going to give you the floor for the first part of this topic.
Thank you, Gabriella. So I'm pleased to be able to give you an update of where we've got to, and thanks again to Sylvia for turning around slides in very short order. So I want to run through the things that we discussed as a work stream to deal with the feedback from the board. I think the first thing is that although we did it for very good reasons, the use of the words heightened public interest only added a dimension of confusion to our discussions, which the work stream was keen to avoid. And so therefore we've changed now the applicability of part 5 not to refer to heightened public interest, to avoid a clash with the PI definition and the public interest discussion more broadly. So now we'll use this revised terminology that says part 5 will apply to sustainability assurance engagements, where the sustainability on which the sustainability information on which the firm expresses an opinion is. And then what we've done is the board gave us feedback about flipping the ordering of the criteria that we had there. So firstly, now we've got reported in accordance with the general purpose framework, and then we've got a flip of point B. So we begin with the fact that it's required to be provided in accordance with law or regulation, changed available to disclosed as a slightly more precise and helpful term. And there was a question about should we look again at the supporting decision making by investors or other stakeholders. Actually, the work stream got to a position where we felt that that was actually quite a helpful articulation and quite a good position to be in. So we have retained that wording. So hopefully that will address the feedback from the board in that respect. And of course, what we're looking at in terms of just clarifying the sort of route to market is obviously where we've got sustainability assurance on information which is developed in accordance with a special purpose framework, or there are entity developed criteria. Our proposal is that would then go down the 4B route. We'll continue to engage with IESBA and with our stakeholders to determine whether or not that is going to be effective in meeting their needs. And then one of the things that we're asked to look at is guidance on direct engagements and attestation engagements. Obviously, there are definitions in the code to align with the IESBA definitions. And of course, in addressing the feedback from the board, we will maintain the code's drafting conventions. So not repeating further definitions within part 5 of the code. However, we are looking at what non-authoritative guidance that we will propose to the board to develop alongside the revisions to the code. Effectively, that just shows you your sort of walk through now, which is the diagram that we had the other day. But of course, what we've done now is got rid of the heightened public assurance, heightened public interest designation, and we just go down the route of looking at sustainability engagements that are either subject to part 5 or that are going down that part 4B route. Dependent on whether or not it's a PA, or if it's a non-PA, then of course you've got that voluntary application or the use of other ethical requirements that are at least as demanding as the code, and that's consistent with where the IESBA are on ISSA 5000. Interesting discussion about fees, and obviously that builds on the existing requirement in the code for the firm to reassess threats when it's got significant reliance on individual clients, and that's something that we teased out in those discussions. In terms of the disclosure of those fees, obviously we did discuss the quite extensive conversation that we had around this table. One of the things that we'll be looking at is how we produce guidance to help with the application of this section. In particular, there are various determinations to be made. How do we help with those? One of the there we go. There were suggestions that were made in the discussion about combining audit fees and sustainability fees when looking at the overall assessment of threats under the fees provision. Where we got to as a work stream is that obviously, as things currently stand, the legal framework is that audit and sustainability assurance engagements are separate engagements. The auditor does have some responsibilities in respect of information in an annual report, but that is as the status of other information, and therefore that is considered as that is included within part of the audit fee, but a separate assurance engagement is nevertheless a separate fee. We were challenged over the fact that the approach that we'd got prioritized sort of audit over sustainability. But in a sense, that's sort of our jumping off point, because audit is the regulated service. And that initially drives that consideration where the auditor is also providing sustainability engagements, where the auditor is only providing sustainability engagements and other non-assurance services. What we've got is an equivalent approach. And of course, that's one of the drivers that we've had from the outset, that we look at maintaining equivalence. So that's sort of one that we continue to look at. Obviously, a number of the things that we've already said is that there are various issues here that we are going to be raising with the reference group that Channa is convening for a month in the summer, because the agenda is now so long. On group sustainability assurance, this was something where the board was interested, but also we recognise we need to learn more. And actually, one of the things that Sylvia was just updating me on is the fact that we have already reached out individually to some members of the reference group. We've had communication from one of the members of the reference group, and they have some excellent insight into how these group engagements actually work in practice. So Sylvia and Keith are going to have a conversation with that member next week, and that will inform our discussions that we have when the work stream meets again in London in mid-July. So this just explains the route through in terms of what we're going to do to continue to develop section 405 as part 5, to make sure that that actually reflects the way that these engagements are delivered. And of course, what we've noticed after the discussions this week is we also need to incorporate within our text a reference across to the provisions that will arise from Laurie's project, the use of experts project, to make sure that we've got something that fits cohesively together. In terms of the PI definition, in part 5, there is a little clarification to the text in terms of making that neutral, but actually still maintaining the point that the entity is a PI if it meets the definition of a PI, full stop, because that's what follows in our code. Or of course, if a jurisdiction decides that an entity is to be added to the list of PIs in that particular jurisdiction. But that is consistent in terms of our thinking and where we propose to land. And then our consideration then moved on to some of the definitions that we had some good feedback from. So in a sense, we sort of slightly upended this because we're trying to align with the IESBA in terms of the terminology. So recognizing that in the sustainability world, you don't have an engagement partner. What is the term that we use as an equivalent? So for the engagement leader, we've got that terminology. What we'd also got as a parallel to a wider partner in the firm was this term of service leader. But we had quite an interesting discussion as a group. And one of the difficulties there is that effectively, if you look at a parallel in a firm, that would cover service partners, but not all partners, so it wouldn't be equivalent. So therefore, what we've done here is tweak the wording and effectively gone back to a more straightforward articulation of any individual with authority to bind the firm, which is exactly sort of where we wanted to be in terms of clarity. But we'll continue to discuss and to develop this again in our July meeting. In terms of oh yeah, it works. In terms of partner rotation, I think the general view from the board was that our inclination was the right one. So therefore, when you're looking at partner rotation and long association requirements, we should include in aggregate time spent as the engagement partner on an audit and as being a key sustainability assurance partner. That will mean that we've got a conforming amendment to do in Part 4A to make sure that it doesn't just work one way. So you're caught if you move from being audit to sustainability. We also need to ensure you're caught on sustainability to audit. But my reference to real time is that we were looking at that definition, and Sadia this morning has actually emailed us an alternative formulation of wording that actually might be more helpful, because it will avoid unpicking a lot of the long association guidance that the board developed. So thank you for that as a proposal, and we'll have that on our agenda to discuss when we meet in July. But I think it does help in terms of not creating additional work through having a simpler definition that will actually, rather than have a separate sort of point D, will incorporate within point C the sustainability, the parallel that the sustainability assurance leader is actually another type of key partner. And therefore that would be an easier formulation for us to deal with. So then where do we go? We will be engaging with the reference group. We've already got quite a long list of things that we want to engage with them over. And as I said, Sylvia and Keith will be meeting with one of our reference group members, hopefully in the week ahead. We'll continue to engage with the IEESB, particularly after their meeting next week, when hopefully they'll be in a position where they finalise their exposure draft for issue. We're meeting on the 12th to the 14th of July. It's a meeting where both work streams will be in London, so there'll be an opportunity for us to further coordinate as well as take forward our own proposals. We recognise, as I said earlier this week, the demands on the board posed by the fact that you've had an enormous amount of information to deal with at this meeting. So one of the things that we're looking to do is circulate some updated drafts for the board's input at the end of July. So you'll get that by email. Obviously, we will address any comments that we get from board members in advance of the board meeting. So if you do have comments, you know, if you're lying there on your sunbed and you feel like reading a chunk of the code and giving us your comments, please do. And that will mean that hopefully we can break the papers into 2 chunks, and that will make the meeting in September a rather more manageable meeting. But with that input, and hopefully with further sort of comment and direction from the board, our plan is to have a first read of the independent standards at the meeting in September. And you'll see obviously all of the papers posted for that, but we'll flag those that have already been out in that end of July block that hopefully you'll have commented on and will have dealt with. And then your focus can just be on the remainder. So that, Gabriella, is everything that I wanted to cover. Sylvia, Keith, have I missed anything? No, all good. There we go.
Thank you very much, Mark. Comments from the board on these reformulated, adjusted proposals from Workstream 1 on the independent standards for sustainability assurance. No comments? Well, I would have one question, but I think that we can take it offline because it's a matter of understanding exactly, so I will not make you lose time with that. Are there no comments? May I assume? Andy, please.
All right, thank you. No, thanks to the work stream. I understand what you've taken, the positions, how you've taken them, and I appreciate the to support decision making by investors and other stakeholders staying in. I'm not going to reopen that. I just would request that there be a marker put down for ultimately when we have an exposure draft or explanatory memo to specifically flag that bit. So rather than try to remember it in September or December, I thought I'd maybe push that onto your.
Thank you, Andy. And one of the things that just responding specifically to that is that when we met earlier this week as a work stream, we've already sort of got a running memo of these are the things that we need to make sure are included in the explanatory memorandum, because as you say, by the time we get to the end of the year and we're writing it, there's a horrific inevitability without that we'll miss something.
Nothing.
Okay, thank you very much. Andy, Begonia, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the very fast changes, accommodating the suggestions of yesterday. I have a question about the fees discussion about the adding or not adding the assurance to the audit in terms of deciding about the threat of independence for the auditor. Is that going to be, I understood the position of the task force is to separate audit is a regulated activity, which is different to assurance, but is that going to be asked in the consultation? That's my only question. Confirm that. Thank you.
Yes, so we're looking at how we frame those questions, particularly because we're going to be dealing with a lot of we're going to be dealing with a number of different scenarios in the same issue. So is this going to work where someone is both the auditor and the assurance provider? Does this work where someone is the assurance provider but not the auditor? And actually, is it going to operate in the same way? And where we are at the moment is that our proposal sort of reflects the correct legal position for most jurisdictions. But I think the way we wanted to sort of try and frame the question was that, is this going to be something that is going to effectively sort of stand the test of time? Because a number of board members said, well, you know, we could be moving towards integrated reporting. We could see that sustainability becomes part of the audit. And therefore, we've got to have something that, you know, is fit for purpose in a global code where some jurisdictions may move faster than others. So that will be one of the areas of questioning that specifically we want to pick out.
Thank you, Begonia and Mark. Christelle.
Just to build a little bit on that subject. You say we have a legal analysis that this is the way it should be for now. But as the CSRD has put a mandatory obligation on the corporations in Europe, maybe they would have a thought on that could be helpful before. You went through that.
We have, Christelle, and perhaps invite Jens in as well to comment, but even with CSRD, CSRD is still the provision and assurance of sustainability information. It is not the incorporation of sustainability information into an audit.
And they are making exactly what we have proposed. They are saying it is a non-audit service, but it is mandatory by the CSRD, and that's why it's not in the bucket, but it is a non-audit service. And so that is the status. It's not called audit, it is called sustainability assurance, and that's why we call it, but the difficulty is that the European regulation on audit is talking on non-audit services, not on non-assurance services. And by these differences, you see it is very important if we are keeping our terminology with audit, assurance, non-assurance, then we have to be clear with these three categories and then making only clear which you have to judge. And there we are saying if a service, an assurance service or a non-assurance service is required by law, you have a different threat. And that means either you can say there's nothing to add because it's not a dangerous service, so to say, or you have to make a further judgment, but that is jurisdictional specific. So that is a little bit the thought process, and it's mirrored also in the CSRD with these terminology differences.
Thank you very much, Christel and Jens. And now I will change my mind, and now we'll make the question that I had in mind, because with this explanation, I really think that I have to have clear. On slide 6, when you say that suggestions for combining audit fees and fees for sustainability, and then the second paragraph, if sustainability information is covered within the annual report, it will be part of fees for audit engagement. What exactly is the meaning of this? If it's covered in the annual report on a case-by-case basis, if it's included there, or if the framework includes it in the annual report?
So at the moment, sustainability information is usually in the front half of the annual report. So in respect of the audit of that information, I say audit, it is audited in accordance with ISO 720. So just as other information. So where the auditor does work on other information, that is included as part of the audit fee. Where there is a separate assurance report or assurance conclusion on the sustainability information, that is not currently part of the audit fee. That is a separate non-audit fee. So it's just delineating out the fact that the sustainability information, where it's included in an annual report, is subject to assurance under 720, and that there's two. So it's just making clear that where it's part of the audit, there is an element of the audit fee. Where it's a separate assurance engagement, it is a separate assurance engagement fee.
Okay, that will drive the reality in that case, but we'll see. Ken.
Yeah, I think we have to be careful as to how we are interpreting the work that's done on, let's say, sustainability information that's included in annual reports, because under the auditing standards, the work isn't really assurance. It is about reading the information to make sure there aren't any inconsistencies with the audited information. So it's a different level of, let's say, work that's done. So we have to explain it carefully when we go out on exposure that, we're not suggesting that work that's done under the ISAs relative to the other information, which in this case is a sustainability information, is not actually assurance on that information, because there isn't a separate opinion, for example, that's rendered on that other information. So I think just some precision in the language, I think, just might help.
No, thanks, Ken. That's helpful.
Thank you, Ken and Mark. Luigi.
And thank you, Mark, for the explanation. I'm fine with this slide and with the purpose of the task force to go through this process and find a reasonable solution. If I can add more on that, I recommend the task force to consider the change we are implementing with this project to the intrinsic nature of this work, where basically we can continue calling it assurance, non-audit, and so on. But at the end, we are applying the same independence rules of an audit. And therefore, I don't think we can avoid thinking the consequences of this change. And therefore, it would be very strange to continue considering a like audit independence work as a non-assurance service that could raise or result in independence risks, different from those coming from the audit fee and so on and so forth. So I recommend that the task force to conduct their analysis also considering this point.
No, thank you, Luigi. We'll certainly do that. And of course, as you say, the most important thing that the task force needs to make sure it's happy with is we've got a consistent and equivalent approach to independence assessments and evaluations that when we're looking at these engagements. So we'll certainly make sure that that's factored into our discussions in July.
Thank you very much, Mark and Luigi. This will probably be one of the most discussed topics again, but we'll see what our stakeholders will have to say about this, because as we can still see from the discussion around the table, it's not absolutely black and white, and there are some nuances that we will have to take on board. Okay, I don't see, Luigi, do you still want to make any question? Okay, I don't see anyone else. So may I assume that the board is comfortable with these adjustments and that the working group can move forward working on the basis of this direction? Fine, very well. Thank you very much, Mark, task force or working group, and staff, Sylvia and Kit, for this good work. And now we will move to the adjusted proposals from the work stream 2 on ethics standards for sustainability reporting and assurance. Christelle, please.
Thank you, Chair. Can we have our slideshow on the screen, please? So we have, no, it's not the chart. We have listed our the collected validations, remarks, suggestions of the board. And we propose to go through them to share what our workstream proposes on each of them, following the preparation meetings we had this week. Maybe I could start with a slide that I don't have, which is the last one of workstream 1. Mark commented upon the next steps, and we just have the same agenda and calendar. So this is to make it clear. Okay, I'll start without the slide. The selected issues, the issues we selected were on the ethics assurance standards, the questions of the applicability paragraph on the scope, the question of NOCLA, we discussed a lot. On the reporting standards, the final validation of the scope, and on the definition of sustainability information, some key inputs we have to onboard for revised proposition to the board. So the initial intent was that I give the floor to Laura for the assurance standards. It's 1 minute, so maybe 1 minute. Okay. I don't have a song. No, that's out of my reach. I'm sorry. Yeah, almost there. Right. So happily we have gone through the first one already. If it wants to, yes. And now, Laura, please.
Thank you, Christelle. So just a brief, sorry, my fault. Just a brief recap on where the board landed in terms of the scope for the ethics standards for assurance of sustainability reporting. So just the board was supportive of workstream 2 going forward with option 2, which basically is covers the sustainability assurance engagements that are no longer called of heightened public interest, but that meet that criteria that we saw Mark presenting earlier, as well as the rest of the relationship with those same sustainability assurance clients, given that that rest of the relationship can have impacts on the public trust that underpins this type of services. There was one outstanding issue regarding the scope and what to include in the new part 5. And that was related to the applicability paragraphs, as Christelle mentioned. Instead of calling it applicability paragraphs, we've called it here equivalent part 2 because it's more user-friendly. And so when the workstream met this week, after the board discussions, we looked into Accent Part 2 and the sections in Accent Part 2 and really went through all of these sections and to see whether or not it would be adequate to include them in the new part 5. And so we have here a proposal, or 3 proposals really, in terms of section 270, which is the pressure to breach compliance with the fundamental principles. The workstream is proposing to include it in the new part 5. Because that pressure may come from, or whatever it may come from the clients, the firms, or other parties, it may indeed compromise the performance of sustainability assurance and therefore impair the public interest that underpins that service. So it's an important factor to consider when trying to prevent greenwashing, as the board also discussed on Tuesday. And since it's not explicitly covered in part 1, in the fundamental principles and the conceptual framework, etc., the workstream believes it's adequate to include an equivalent section 217 part 5. Regarding sections 220 and 240, these relate to 2 non-assurance or non-assurance activities, which is the preparation of information on the one hand, and decision-making activities, and also reporting of information. So since it's outside the scope, it's not related to assurance, the proposal here is not to include equivalent sections 220 and 240 in part 5. Regarding the remaining sections 200, 210, 230, 250, and 260, so the work stream here, we're talking about applying the conceptual framework, conflicts of interest, inducements, and acting with sufficient expertise, and NOCLAR. So when looking at these sections, the link to sustainability assurance and the impact that they may have, these provisions may have in the public interest that underpins that activity is not immediately clear, or it's not direct. Because, for instance, if we look at conflicts of interest, section 210, it relates to conflicts of interest within the firm. And if we look at these provisions in these sections and examples of conflicts of interest that may arise, and we see that one of those examples is an accounting serving in the board of 2 employing organizations, and there's a risk of acquiring confidential information that may be used to the advantage or the disadvantage of the other employing organization. there is not a direct link here to the provision of sustainability assurance. And if we look, for instance, in Section 250 in the inducements within the firm, and we look at an example of a self-interest threat that is the accountant being offered part-time employment by a vendor. So there's not a direct link and a direct correlation to the provision of sustainability assurance. And for this reason, the workstream is proposing not to include equivalent sections into Part 5. Of course, it's important for the practitioner, for the sustainability assurance practitioner, to behave ethically in all activities and all aspects of its services. But again, that will be included in that encouragement that the workstream 2 has proposed to include in the introductory paragraphs of Part 5. For Section 230, which is acting with sufficient expertise, and while this is included in that third bucket, the reasoning, so it is covered by Part 1, acting with sufficient expertise, especially by the fundamental principles of integrity and professional competence. And therefore, the workstream 2 considers that it's not essential to include an equivalent Section 230 in Part 5. But we also recognize that since this is mostly an unregulated market, the provision of sustainability assurance, there may be some advantage in including an equivalent 230 in Part 5 for additional guidance. And so I would maybe pause here for any board's views on this issue.
Thank you very much, Christelle and Laura. The views of the board are welcome, of course, on every part of this presentation, but specifically on this question about the possible inclusion of Section 230 in Part 5. Chana, please.
So Laura, what provision in 230 would you include that's not in the Section 100 equivalent?
So as I mentioned, the whole Section 230, we believe that it's already sufficiently covered by Part 1 and the fundamental principles, notably the professional competence and the integrity, because if we look at that section, it seems to be covered. But if we are to include it in Part 5, it would be the whole, an equivalent section, not cherry picking the provisions, but like we will do in 270, it would be a whole equivalent, of course, adapting and getting rid of what is not relevant and including what is relevant, but it would be the whole section.
Okay. I mean, I'm not sure that it adds a huge benefit by including it. So I'm sort of on the side of not including it unless there's something critical.
It's for sure our statement. It's not that it's critical because it would be not precise enough in the Section 1 of Part 5, etc. But we all had an intense discussion on the issue of the professional skills and competencies, and therefore at this unmatured stage of the assurance, sustainability assurance profession or activity, it might be a way to reinforce the message. This is the thinking behind.
Okay, Chana, thank you, Chana and Christelle. Any other views? I'd really like to hear the board about this, because as the workstream 2 is very openly making the question, it would be important to listen to you. Sadia.
So I was hesitant to raise my card because I'm not sure which side I fall in, and I think it's because we have
correctly done, scoping in paragraph section numbers, so which sections are in. But as we go along, we're going to start thinking of concepts that are important to sustainability assurance standards. And when we get there, we might see a need for why the section is important or why the section isn't important. So I'm happy with the direction we're going. And I think that as we progress, we'll be able to see whether the need is there or the need wasn't. But having it in is easier than bringing it in later.
Thank you, Sadia. More views? Thank you, Luigi.
It is difficult to try to have an assessment on a judgment without seeing what would be in practice. But as a preliminary reaction, I would rather having it included as a preference, and let's say later eventually excluding it if it is not relevant, because it seems to me that it includes certain relevant statements, even though probably, as Chana said, they are also included in the fundamental principle and in section 1. But on a preliminary basis, I don't see why it cannot be included.
Thank you, Luigi. Chana.
Yeah, I mean, I'm okay. It's only like 1 page, 1.5 pages to the material. So why not include it first, and then we can see, I guess, in September when we have all the material together, how it works.
Okay, thank you. Rich?
Well, this section 2 and the code sections marked are for PAIBs, and we're addressing standards for professional, audit or assurance standards for sustainability. So I thought that the approach taken here was appropriate from the perspective that we looked at the basis for conclusion from the prior project that brought the applicability standard in, and it was 220 and 270 were the 2 sections that were specifically referenced of having applicability broadly and related to the applicability paragraph in 300. So there is a basis for why this approach was put down based on the historical position of the board. And I'm not concerned that we start putting all this in and then creating confusion around, are we trying to provide standards to PIIBs who are doing the reporting, which I thought we were not doing at this point. I'm supportive of where the task force is. I don't see putting these extra sections in beyond what has been proposed.
Thank you, Rich. Well, a bit split views around the table. Any other comments? So, Christelle and Laura, I think that you will address it the best way, but yeah.
We'll work on a 230 proposition. We'll see also with the SRG where they stand with added value on putting meat on the specifics of sustainability, professional skills issues, and see if it's worth keeping it at the end. If you agree with this working path.
I think so, Christelle. It will be, of course, a PDF here at the end. We decided not to include it because we know how pressured.
Yeah, we have mixed views.
How pressured you are, but yeah, but considering the mixed views,
we have to deal with it.
I think it's better to see it in action and then make a decision. I must confess that I have some sympathy, even if I understand the arguments against. I have some sympathy for the fact that this is really something important in a new area, and when we are involving non-professional accountants. But I can see the 2 sides of the moon. Ken.
Yeah, thank you. And I just wondered, I'm not trying to give the answer here. I think it's more for work stream to maybe reflect further on it, and more specifically to look at the guidance that's in section 230, because where section 230 comes in handy is really to provide that granularity in the guidance in terms of the considerations the individual perhaps should be going through in thinking about their competence or their capability actually to be part of the engagement or to contribute to the engagement. So some of the guidance, for example, speaks to practical issues. You know, do they have sufficient time to perform the engagement? Do they have enough information? Are there restrictions in terms of their ability to have adequate information to perform the engagement? Do they have sufficient experience, training or education? And do they have sufficient resources? So there's a granularity in the guidance that speaks at the end of the day to the issue of professional competence. And yes, we can fall back on the fundamental principle of, you know, whatever is in part one to say, well, you know, that is a principle. But when we are actually out there in the field where all the action is taking place, and we are thinking about all these, in this case, non-PAs, because for the PAs, they will be covered under the applicability provision, but for the non-PAs, do they have enough of that, as I say, that the practical guidance to help them actually think through their obligation to have professional competence and be able to act with due care. So that would be perhaps my suggestion, to think along those lines and then make a determination as to whether it's, but at the end of the day, I mean, to Chana's point, this is a one-page set of provisions. And, you know, I mean, I'm not sure this is asking necessarily a lot of work for non-PAs. But again, I'm not trying to give the answer, but I'll leave that with you.
Thank you, Ken. So can we move?
So in terms of NOCLAR, sorry, there were a couple of board comments that the workstream 2 also analyzed and discussed. And the first one would be the addressing non-compliance not only with laws and regulations, but also with voluntary representations of or commitments by the entity that are not included in laws or regulations. And regarding this aspect, the workstream 2 proposes not including this in including this in the NOCLAR section. So having the NOCLAR section not covering this kind of non-compliance with voluntary representations or commitments. Because if the entity makes a public or a voluntary commitment or representation and then does not live up to those commitments or representations, that is actually something that could be covered by the assurance engagement itself. So the entity is disclosing something and then not complying with it. In terms of that last bullet that we had on the screen that the workstream 2 had proposed deleting, because it makes reference, is a factor that the sustainability assurance practitioner needs to consider when assessing the communication with the auditor of the entity. That factor on the likely materiality of the matter for the audit of financial statements, and that the board consider that it should not be deleted, maybe rewritten, but not deleted, keep it there. The workstream 2, what we discussed is that however we draft it, the issue will be always the same. It's whether is it fair for a non-professional accountant who is not aware of the materiality that is used in the financial statements to identify a matter that is material. And so, but for now, what we propose is to retain that factor and run it through the sustainability reference group and understand from a non-PA perspective, is it fair? Is it appropriate to have such expectations from a non-PA? also in the topic of communication between sustainability assurance practitioners and the auditors of the entity, there was a suggestion to consider that kind of communication also beyond NOCLAR. So not only when non-compliance with laws or regulations is in question, but also in a generic way. The workstream to consider that this is not essentially an ethics issue. It's more for the assurance technical standards to address the communication between the two practitioners. So it's a matter for us to coordinate with the IESBA and see how ISA 5000 addresses that. And then there was also a comment on reversing this communication. So what we're seeing in part 5 is the communication from the sustainability assurance practitioner with the auditor. Should it also be reversed? Should the auditor also have an obligation to communicate with the sustainability assurance practitioner? So this would be something to a confirming change in part 3. The workstream to discuss this matter and decided for now to propose not to make any change to extend part 3 because there are some confidential and professional secrecy issues preventing the auditor to communicate freely with other parties. Another reason it's, again, this does not seem to be essentially an ethics issue. It's again for the assurance technical standards, so something for us to coordinate with the IASB. And if there are, in fact, some ethics related issues, maybe they can be addressed at the post-implementation review of the NOCLAR project. And then in terms of the comments that we heard in terms of the right scope of NOCLAR in part 5 and the type of laws and regulations that are included, I could go to the next slide because in the materials that were made available to the board, we had in the new draft part 5 the scope of NOCLAR proposed. So we tried to keep the scope as much as possible parallel to the extant scope of NOCLAR in part 3, of course, changing what relates to financial statements to sustainability information, but it's essentially covering the same scope. And in terms of the lists of laws and regulations that are covered in NOCLAR in part 5, again, we used the extant provision in part 3. We added some laws and regulations that are related to sustainability, and we changed the order because in extant part 3, we already have some laws and regulations related to sustainability. As we can see, the environmental protection and the public health and safety. And for part 5, we are proposing to switch the order and bring them up because they're more relevant from a sustainability perspective. And just to emphasize that these are just examples, but it's the most relevant examples. And I would pause here for any questions.
Very well, thank you very much. Comments on this proposal on the way NOCLAR will be reflected on the part 5? Well, let's assume that the board is Rania.
Yeah, thank you. So I think, I mean, personally, I'm not very comfortable with this. I mean, I think the task force should or the work stream. Yeah. So I would recommend that the work stream reconsider how it's including NOCLAR, because I feel that we are sort of transposing it, just sort of exactly mirroring it from the audit requirements to the sustainability assurance requirements. I think this particular area warrants further consideration. I mean, when you think of NOCLAR, I believe it was very progressive in terms of expanding the responsibility of the auditor. So if you want to, I mean, take to project the spirit of NOCLAR to sustainability assurance, I don't think that's what we're doing here.
But why, Rania? Sorry, just for me to understand better, why you think it's not reflected here?
Because you're just looking at compliance with laws and regulations. Yeah, yes, I know. No, I know this. I know, I understand this very well. I know this is non-compliance with laws and regulations, but so the idea is that in a sustainability assurance context, you're looking at the social responsibility. That's the spirit of sustainability assurance or sustainability disclosures. You're looking at the social responsibility aspect of a certain businesses or organization's conduct. So I think the focus, if we want to transpose the spirit of NOCLAR, that's what I'm saying. I realize that if you look at NOCLAR is non-compliance with rules and regulations. But if you wish to transpose the spirit of NOCLAR, you have to go beyond rules and regulations. That's my opinion.
Thank you, Rania. I see your point now. I understand what you mean. It's thinking big and ambitiously. Well, I see your point. Not sure that it's going to be possible. Well, but it's for the work stream to reflect upon. It's a different approach. The NOCLAR approach is, as we said, laws and regulations. What you're saying, as I understand it, this is an area where other considerations should be taken into account alongside non-compliance with laws and regulations, whatever they are. But I think that the work stream will reflect upon that. Laura.
Thank you. If I may, I think that's the first issue that we covered. So this is laws and regulations, and whatever falls outside of laws and regulations are voluntary commitments or disclosures or representations. And that is actually something I would say for the subject of the engagement itself, because if it's a disclosure voluntarily made by the company, then the practitioner will test if they have if they are abiding by those voluntary commitments. And so it would obviously not fall under this section, but it also not require a specific section because that's the engagement itself.
May I react? Laura, my point is from an ethics point of view. Remember, this is a code of ethics that you're writing. From an ethics point of view, if you are the practitioner on this engagement and it comes to your attention that the organization is engaged in certain practices, that it is making some forced representations with regards to its practices. From an ethical point of view, remember that's not law. It's not about laws and regulations. We are talking about social responsibility. That, in my opinion, this is the spirit of ESG. ESG is taking the responsibility of those charged with governance beyond laws and regulations. I think it's important that as we develop the code to address sustainability, we keep that in mind. We cannot be narrowly focused on the audit perspective. The whole point of sustainability is taking these engagements beyond the laws and regulations and the numbers. It's taking them to a higher level. It's important that we pay attention to this issue. Yeah.
I will try to embark this. The level of ethics issue you identify and the answer you have to it should be consistent. But depending, for example, you can have high ethics standards that are expected from certain stakeholders that are out of reach of businesses in certain situations. If the entity is saying or disclosing, I want to be at, or I am acting, my strategy, my processes is to reach that status tomorrow, or I say that I'm at this status. If it is part of the assurance engagement, there will be consequence if there is a discrepancy. If it's a non-assured disclosure, it's an expression in some kind of communication. And if there is an obvious gap between such an expression, public expression, and what the assurance provider is seeing, okay, it is another kind of consequences for the assurance provider. Namely, I would expect him to report that to those charged with governance. Okay, then the NOCLAR is something else. It's law and regulation, and you have a lot of legal constraints. And this is why Ken told us that it took 5 years to get into that. You need to have a lot of component to be able to report the way we ask them to report. And part of it is to be a regulated activity where it is mandatory to do so. And so, it is already sensitive to take this NOCLAR and provisions and transpose it on for the moment, non-regulated business. So I understand what you say, but it should have another answer, and I wouldn't put everything in the same bucket of you encounter something which is stressing you a little bit, or where there is a gap between the walk and the talk of the entity, or there is a gap with laws and regulation. It's different items that we should find to some extent, but not in the same place.
Thank you.
Take much more of the board's time. My only point, I understand that, let's assume an organization is claiming that it is, let's say, in pursuit of certain goals. And let's assume that the practitioner has doubt as to these, the accuracy of these aspirations, let's put it this way. I realize that if this is not within the scope of the practitioner's work, obviously it's not going to be, he or she is not going to work further to affirm or negate these aspirations. And so this is beyond the scope of their work. That's what I understand this fully. Okay, my point is, let's assume the practitioner, that's basically the scenario in my mind. And the practitioner is, let's say, engaged in a certain area of sustainability, say compliance or whatever. And they come across reasons to believe that, for example, there are some, I don't know, some, don't want to say foul play, because let's say it's out of the scope of NOCLAR, but in climate or something else. If they feel that there is something wrong that's happening, then I think I don't know. It's easy, obviously it's easy for me to say what they should, or what you should be doing, or I don't know exactly how that should be translated. All I'm saying is that they, in my mind, in the spirit of sustainability and ESG, they should have some form of a responsibility that extends beyond the scope of laws and regulations. That's all I'm saying. Of course, I realize that if we're talking about aspirations, I mean, who can really know what the intention of the CEO or the management is? But it might be relating to past performance, that they know there is something that is inaccurate. There are inaccuracies that have been intended or intentional. And so that's basically the scenario in my mind. I just suggest that you look into it, and that's my point. Thank you.
Thank you, Rania. Laurie, please.
Yeah. I just wanted to say I'm supportive of the thought process that the task force has in doing this, and I think it's great that they've added some of the ESG type laws up there. into this. It seems sensible to me. I mean, I'm not wordsmithing this for everything that's in it, but it seems to me like a sensible approach. The one thing I would just say, I feel this is a pretty balanced way to do this. And while I understand Rania's point about aspirationally, from an ethics standpoint, I would say one thing from a practitioner point of view. I'm not an ESG practitioner, but even from audit practitioners generally, it is more challenging than people realize. The way NOCLAR is written is a suspected violation of, if you believe there could be a violation, because often you don't have enough information to even make that determination. I think the practical side of this is very challenging to extend it even beyond that, because it's challenging enough. A lot of this is about stuff you, in the course of, when you have access to information and people and you're working with an organization, you may run across something. And this standard stemmed from, post-financial crisis, a belief that people who are working within organizations, not just auditors, but consultants as well, people who are working with organizations have access to and are privy to and may see things that they should have been raising. And so I think that calibration around violation of laws and regulation was very intentional. Even that is hard to discern. And so I'm supportive of that as a cutoff and continuing this on in the sustainability space. It will be, even this will be challenging, by the way, for the group of practitioners that we're talking about, but it feels right to me. Thanks.
Thank you, Laurie. Hector.
Maybe this is helpful for the analysis of this, and please correct me if I get it wrong, but an auditor that sees the breaching of a contract as part of the audit, this would not fall under NOCLAR. And it's I think pretty much in line with what Rania is saying, is that the company is supposed to be doing something because there is a private contract, for example, and the auditor sees that there is something that it's not in compliance with that contract, but is not required to fall under NOCLAR. I think what Rania is saying is should fall in that same space. I don't know what the obligation of the auditors are in the event that that happens, but maybe they should follow the same channel and not be under NOCLAR.
Thank you, Hector. Vanya, please.
Thank you. I understand your concern, Rania, but we have to respect the due process. NOCLAR is something that is running, and there is a provision or revision that soon. So we cannot put a session and say it's an equivalent to NOCLAR and change it, because that will be affecting the concept of NOCLAR, and you create so much noise that will create resistance to what we are doing instead of promoting that. So what we took note is to keep it in mind, to put it on the table during the revision of NOCLAR, and then let's try to include that. It's not that we do not agree with you, it's just that we have to follow the due process to see to those kind of things. Yeah.
Thank you, Vanya. Mark, please.
I think a couple of points. Firstly, I agree with where the task force has got to. I think it's a proportionate and reasonable approach in the circumstances. I think it's important that the board bears in mind two things. The first is that, the auditor or the assurance provider is not responsible for all of the world's ills. Governments need to legislate to deal with all of the world's ills. And the other thing is, this is a code of ethics, not a code of morals. And we should be careful that it remains a code of ethics and it's not trying to deal with a moral argument.
Thank you, Mark. Rania. Sorry, Sadia.
So I too agree with the direction that the working group has taken. I do want to indulge Rania, because
NOCLAR needs to be kept in line and succinct because it's having an escalated response framework. But I do think that there's other sections in the code that might speak to you, things like inquiring mindset, a conceptual framework. And a suggestion for the working group is, because we might hear this not just on the board, but in consultation, is if we take the topic of greenwashing, how does the code address it? And that wouldn't just be in one section of the code, you'll have to look at it holistically. And that might alleviate the doubt that we are missing those things that aren't legislated, but we know that the practitioner might want to do more or inquire more of.
Thank you, Sadia. Christelle, any reaction?
About greenwashing, there was a very good paper last year to help navigate. Does it make sense to have a specific section? We'll have a thought on that, but I would argue that it's the whole lot that helps limiting or getting rid of greenwashing. But of course, it has to be evident that it is explicitly addressed. Now, is it the word greenwashing or whatever? We'll see about that. But we want to be sure, of course, that all the examples and the settings that we put in the draft get to that path where there is a limitation and disparity of greenwashing. But in the field of the ethical issues or big issues that we have in sustainability, of course, there are other issues that Rania was raising about everything is not in the law, like Mark said, or it would everything would fall under NOCLAR provisions. So limiting pollution is in the law with threshold. What about what is below? So everything is not falling to the responsibility of the assurance provider. Everything is not falling into his mission, but I would argue that if during his mission he's falling on things which seem problematic, there is a path to inform those, I would argue, those charged with governance, of course management, but those charged with governance, if it's an important issue that falls into their remit in terms of allocating the right resources, for example, to the subject. And so we will make sure that anyway we find a way to explain to the board in September how these different situations are addressed with Part 5. I think it's the best we can do.
Thank you, Christelle. I'll have a few things to add, but Ken first.
Thank you, Gabrielle. So just a few thoughts, I guess, or observations, in reaction to all this very good discussion we've had. I guess what I would say in relation to Rania's comment, which is a fair challenge or more a question, maybe there are different ways to look at it. I don't know if Laura, if you could flip to the previous slide. So Rania, if I were to take your comment and your question is not so much that the practitioner has observed, let's say, an instance of misconduct. It's not necessarily a breach of laws and regulations because it's an observation. Somebody's doing something that transcends laws and regulations, but it's a perception that there's misconduct. Now, I would say the way we have scoped out and clearly this is just a draft that Workstream 2 has put forward, and we can look at it in our own quiet time. The scoping of those laws and regulations, first of all, is very broad. So what the practitioner observes might not necessarily be an issue that's outside the bounds of laws and regulations, because first of all, our section on no law requires the account to investigate the matter. So if you see something, the code will ask you to go and look into it. So investigate, make sure you understand what it is about. Is it actually an issue of non-compliance laws and regulations? Because on the face of it, you might think this is nothing to do with laws and regulations, but maybe as you dig further, actually there's a law that speaks to the issue, and it is a law that has a direct effect on the determination of the disclosures of the client sustainability information, or has a fundamental impact on the operations of the business. So that could be one line of thinking, that actually you have to actually understand what's happening. On the other hand, and maybe that's to Mark's point, if I were to take the issue of sexual harassment in the workplace, for example, and maybe that's perhaps a more practical example. I mean, you can come up with many examples, but let's take that issue. Now, many jurisdictions have approached the issue of sexual harassment in different ways. I mean, in the US, it is very strict. I mean, in New York State, you have to be extremely careful as to what you say, do, or whatever, right? And in fact, every year here in our offices, we have to go through annual training. And I think it even extends to board members. So you may receive an email asking you to go for more training on this issue of sexual harassment, because there are laws and regulations that are, as I say, very strict in New York State and certainly in the US. But in another jurisdiction, that may be part of the culture. There isn't a law or regulation that says you cannot say a bad joke about Mark, for example, or about China. I'm not picking on Mark and China just because I don't like them, but there may be. So I think it is contextual, and in those jurisdictions, because there are no laws and regulations that prohibit that sort of conduct and behavior, from your perspective, because you think, in the context of ESG and the issue of fair treatment, etc., that this is not proper, this is certainly not sustainable, etc. Should you, as a practitioner, do something about it? Well, it maybe becomes more sort of a, as Mark says, potentially a moral sort of dilemma. But then I fall back on the fundamental principles of the code, and maybe that's where at the end of the day, the answer to your question lies. The fundamental principles are very broad. They touch on the issue of integrity and also the issue of professional behavior. And at the end of the day, it will come down to association of the accountant, and through the accountant, the association of the profession to the client. If the client is engaged in, let's say, recurring misconduct that is clearly beyond the pale, it's not quite non-compliance with laws and regulations, but the client continually engages in misconduct that is clearly, you as a professional accountant wouldn't think you would want to be associated with this client. I mean, yes, I mean, they're paying your bills, etc. That's one thing, but do you want to continue to be associated? Because sooner or later, whatever they're engaging in might come back to you, right? And therefore, because of you're part of the profession, could you actually bring breach of the fundamental principle of professional behavior, because you might be exposing the profession at large to basically accusations of not actually being a profession that would be held in high regard. So there are issues of reputation, etc. So I think you would come back to that. So again, depending on the context, maybe it's if it's a kind of an isolated incident, it's up to you to make that judgment call. And if it's an issue that's more on the moral side, maybe it's you as a good citizen, you might make that call. But under the code, depending on the nature of the issue, then you might be called to account under the fundamental principle to take the relevant action. So that's a bit of the thought process I would go through. But again, I come back to no claw and how we scope out the coverage of the laws and regulations, these are very broad. And what might, on the face of it, appear not to be anything to do with laws and regulations, actually might have to do something with laws and regulations. So you have to kind of investigate and get to the bottom of it and see where you take it.
Thank you, Ken. If you allow me also one final note about this very good discussion. Rania, thank you for raising it, because even if we keep exactly where we were, and I think that's the direction, we will do it on the basis of a good discussion and having thought about that. And I think that I really understand your starting point and your standpoint when you make this strong comment about this is not enough. And your point that you have raised other times here, and I recall it, that we have, it's not enough just to transpose what we have for the audit standards into the sustainability space. We have to think different. We have to take into account other realities, other risks, other problems, etc. And I couldn't agree more with that perspective and with that approach. So the starting point, I think it's absolutely right. And what you are telling us is that this is a different space, and we will see different things that the provider may see and identify and might or should have to report. This is the standing point. This is right, and I think that we all agree with that. And that you might be at this point, you might be thinking, well, we are not doing what we have to do just because of formal reasons, because it doesn't fall into the existing standards, because we have a due process, because of this and that. I think that we have to look at it in a slightly different way, assuming that your starting point is right, and we all agree with that. But first, there are all those reasons which actually limit our capacity of doing everything. Secondly, it's about if we should include everything within the responsibility of the sustainability provider, because this has to be clear and objective boundaries. What must the sustainability provider report in case he identifies something which is not okay? And this is why this is about non-compliance with laws and regulations. We have to draw the line between what is possible and impossible, relevant and irrelevant. But thirdly, I think that, and that was also my point, Ken, I think that this all is somehow covered by the system, and if not necessarily by the no-CLAR provisions, the principles, the conceptual framework, etc., the guidance. There is something for sure there, and even together with the IESBA rules, or standards, there is something there that may help in certain circumstances, even if it's not no-CLAR, may help address those kind of circumstances. And we also, and I think this is also a little bit to the Mark's point, we have to see the code of ethics and no-CLAR standard within the whole system. There are nowadays the regulators and etc. have been providing everybody, professionals from the many professions, but citizens in general, with a lot of instruments that allow them to report and convey information about things which can be not acceptable or illegal or whatever. So, which brings me to the point that it is not possible, it's not for us, and should not be for us to solve the whole problem. But again, I think that your point that, again, you raised more than once here over these days, that we must think, make sure that we are thinking differently and that we are adjusting what we have to adjust, in fact, in front of a different reality, is something that should stay here very clear on the table, and it should work as a benchmark when we start thinking about a few things, if we should or if we shouldn't. That's my approach. So, well, if Ken?
Thank you, Gabriel. I just had one other question, and that's on slide 7. And that's perhaps a more technical question there. The point about materiality, I just want to be clear as to whether we're talking about the same thing here. We're not, in the context of part 5, we're not addressing the materiality of the matter relative to the audit of the financial statements, but it is relative to the sustainability information. So I just want to make that clear.
Yeah, it's in those provisions that deal with communication with the auditor of the external entity, because we're picking those sections from the.
Oh, so it's relative to communication with the auditor,
yes,
rather than, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Christelle.
So I propose that we go further in our presentation. On the scope of reporting, we acknowledge that the board supported the development of ethics standard for preparers of information, though not in a profession agnostic way. This is part now. However, addressing the board suggestion, the board agreed that the code contains ethics standards that are applicable by everyone preparing financial and sustainability information. And the board recommended to expand the encouragement that we have already started to draft. We proposed this in the introductory part of part 5. And the board recommended to expand this to apply the code to all services and not only insurance. And to cover particularly the reporting issues in a more explicit way. So we have a broad encouragement in our drafting. And what we heard is that the board expressed a recommendation to make more explicitly reference to the preparation of reporting, of disclosures. And also the board recommended to issue an explicit and robust policy statement together with the exposure draft. So inside part 5, in the introductory, make it a little bit more explicit and prepare something more policy statement and some strong communication to go with the exposure draft. This is what we parked in as recommendation from the board on the reporting standards. For the sake of the time, if you allow me to go until the last point, and then we'll take the discussion on the definition of the sustainability information. We have discussed the board's comments, and we will redraft the part in red here to better express the concept of double materiality. We will pull the first bullet in green into the definition part and redraft it to explain what we mean, as we explained on Wednesday. We will add the examples of entities in the value chain such as customers and suppliers as an examples to help explain this expression. We will add the necessary wording in the last bullet to reflect comments on measurement and evaluation and past performance and future prospects. And we will add back a bullet in the description regarding the policies, plans, goals, commitments, and representations of an entity, as it was a recommendation from the board. We would not consider it necessary to explicitly state that information is expressed by an entity, as the definition would be broad and the context will make that clear. I think that it is about expression by the entity. So we want to keep it a little bit as concise as possible. So this is our intention, but there's a little bit more work to do, and we will go through that in July. And just to finish up, just like Mark said, we have the ambition of being able to send to the board end of July first set of drafting, and depending on the challenge of the comments received, to put back on the September board an amended version or a tracking change version, to help get through a very, very big chunk of reading that we committed as a board to have in September. So if there are questions.
Thank you very much, Christelle. Jeff?
Just very quickly, just to add one thing, a related thing. As part of our coordination with the IESBA, we will get back to them, particularly with the sort of sustainability information where our board has landed, just to assist them in terms of their discussions next week. And so we'll make sure we work with our IESBA colleagues on those things.
Thank you, Jeff. Comments? Okay, Christelle, seems that everybody's comfortable with the approach. So thank you very much to all of you, and to the work streams in particular, and the staff supporting the work streams for this progress made this week, and also since the first days of this week's into now. With this, I think that we reached the end of the meeting. Yes, Ken? I have some closing remarks, but
yeah, no, before you move into the closing session, Gabrielle, just a couple of items I think we need to run for the board. First of all, the minutes. The minutes of the March public sessions have been circulated with some very minor editorial refinements. Hopefully you have all received an electronic copy. I would ask if any board member has any comments, any additional comments on the minutes. Nope. So I take it then that the board is approving the minutes for the March meeting. Okay. Thank you very much. And the second item really is an item I mentioned on Monday, and that is the EIS, the Electronic International Standards, the E-code. I'm very pleased to now let the board know that the 2022 version is up on the website. It's gone live, I think, in the last day or so. We're still gonna, at the staff level, run through it, and I know Jean is going through it in detail, and there might be one or two still remaining formatting issues to address. But from a quick glance at it myself, it seems to be in good shape. So I welcome all of you to just go on the website and just kind of run through it and work your way through it. That's good news.
Okay, thank you very much, Ken. I have a problem with the minutes, definitely. I had promised that this time I would remember to submit them for approval at the start of the meeting, but then it didn't happen. So thank you. Fortunately, I will always have Ken to remind me. Thank you so much, and it's an important thing. So as we go to the closing session, to the last part of this meeting, I'd like to first invite Begonia for any final comments or well, whatever you may want to say after these 5 days of board meeting.
Thank you very much, Gabriela. Well, I just want to add that it has been a very intense week indeed, very successful, with a lot of very good comments, and you have been advancing a lot in these several projects, but mainly sustainability and the related external experts project. I think everything is going pretty well. They are extremely relevant from the public interest perspective. And well, I think that with the plan you have for the next month, for the task forces in July, and for the board, for the September meeting, the EDs will be more or less final to be really final in December. So the projects are advancing as planned. So congratulate all of you for the very hard work, and it's been an extreme pleasure. I will not be in the executive meeting today because I have to go to the airport. Thank you.
Okay, Begonia. Well, we will miss you, but thank you very much for your participation. for the contribution on behalf of the PIOB and some personal as well. So thank you for that. And yeah, we'll keep on speaking for sure. Well, we are almost there with the public session of our board meeting. I'd like just to not wrap up because we will be here for another 5 days. But I think that the main takeaway of these 5 days is that we are really making a lot of progress, not only in terms of what the way the working groups and the board is advancing in developing projects and standards, but we are making a lot of progress as well in developments in terms of the approach to the discussion. I'm really happy with how this board is working and approaching the discussions. I'm happy that everybody seems to be completely at ease and comfortable to speak, share ideas, not be in agreement. But this is being made in a very constructive and collaborative way. So I'm really happy with this, the culture and the mood of this board. And I think this is clearly reflected in the quality of the work that we are doing. We are all under pressure, even if we have joked a lot over this week about the pressure and no pressure. We are all under pressure, the staff, working groups, task forces, board. And we must be aware that this makes us very sensitive and sometimes with some possible extra reactions or hyper reactions, which are more than natural in this contexts. But I'm sure that we will overcome all this. That's what I take away from this meeting. On the topics themselves, let me tell you that sustainability. Well, I will not tell you. I will just recall what you, of course, know. We are working mostly on sustainability and the experts, but sustainability is a very complex, difficult, new, uncertain topic, also because it is necessarily impacted by political movements, trends, changes, etc. And so will be. We cannot assume that we reached a point of stability and predictability of what the sustainability world will be. If you have seen the Financial Times this morning, it has a very good article around the tension between standard setters on sustainability that clearly shows that it's not obvious with what is going to happen. But one thing I think it's two things for me are absolutely obvious. One is that this is a one-way journey. It can be, well, the journey can have more curves and can have more characteristics. The highway it can be a highway or a stone path or whatever, but it's a one-way journey. It will not come back. Secondly, that even if in some parts of the world there will be some different approaches, there is already a set of regulation standards, etc. Not only those who are already there, but also those who will be prepared, that will not allow this to simply vanish from our horizon. It's a one-way journey. We don't know. The question is how much, how far, how fast. But the if is completely, for me, out of question. The second is that, and I feel the need to say this because there can be, we don't know, some changes, movements, etc., that may make us raise the question: are we doing the right thing? And my answer, from my perspective, as chair of this board, but not only, is that yes, we are doing the right thing, and we are doing the right thing because from the start, and fortunately, we were open and intelligent enough to hold all the discussions that we had to hold. What we are doing is based on very solid, robust grounds. It's not. We are not being moved by fashion or mainstream trends or whatever. It's because we made the reflection and the path that we had to make, and then we came to the conclusion that this is necessary. And the framework neutral approach, fit for purpose, but framework neutral approach that we already decided to take will save us from some unfortunate difficulties or even unsuccess. This is the approach that we must keep on taking. And I'm sure that from that perspective as well, we will be well succeeded and hopefully very relevant. There are some movements. I'm not going to say much more about that, but there are things happening every day, which I think should allow us to be very positive and optimistic about where we, IESBA, are going and are going to land. I again recommend you to be attentive to. We will try to share with you, but what the Financial Stability Board is about to issue probably next week. It's only one example. Whatever happens, I think we are doing the right thing. The fact that we are working also on the experts helps us advancing also in one of our goals or dreams. It's not a dream, it's a reality already, but of expanding somehow the impact. I will not say the scope. Expand the impact of the code. This is happening assumedly on sustainability with the profession agnostic standards. This is happening with even on sustainability reporting with this approach that you brought today. And that I liked this more positive affirmation of that the code applies to everybody, and then it's mandatory for some of them and it's voluntary for the others, but it applies to everybody with this strong and urgent message about the need for everybody to abide by the code. But the project on the use of experts goes in the same direction. This means that we are creating impacts in other communities, not in a direct way, carefully, with the necessary boundaries, etc. But the code is starting or is continuing to have an impact, a positive impact in terms of ethics on other communities other than the accountants. So this is positive, and I will leave tomorrow, and I hope that you all will leave tomorrow with the impression or the conviction that we really made progress and that we had a wonderful meeting in June in New York 2023. So on tax, we'll see. We still have some journey ahead. It's not the end of the story yet. A lot of work to be done, but the point where we are and where we understood that we are now allows us to be very optimistic. And again, it's going to be a groundbreaking achievement, making these standards go out. So I want to thank all the the participants, those around the table, but also those who allowed some time to join us online, sometimes at very unsocial hours. Thank you for your interest as well, but a very special thank you to the board, and a very, very special thank you to the staff who made this possible, absolutely seamless, and that most of the times in an invisible way worked so hard over the last few days, weeks, months to make this possible, and will keep on doing so. And so I think that our incentive and our support to the staff is critical also to make this possible. Of course, I want to convey my thankfulness also to IFAC for providing us with the conditions for hosting this meeting, also in some very wonderful conditions. And the next board meeting will be held on September, from 12 to 22 September, here in New York, but at the IICPA offices, because the week of our board meeting coincides with the IESBA board meeting, and we could not, of course, we are coordinated, but not that much. So it was not possible to hold the meetings in this room, and we had to find an alternative. It was the same thing last year. We went to Nashville. This year, IICPA kindly accepted to host us in September. So it's around the corner. It's not far from here, but it will be a little bit different. It's like going a bit away. And finally, I think that we will meet still at the executive session, but for Begonia and any of you that may have to leave earlier, safe journeys, safe travels home, and have a nice summer. While I'm sure that we will keep on speaking even over summer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabriela. Lunch is ready, and the planning committee is meeting over lunch in the green room. I would suggest, because I am aware that some of you have relatively early flights to catch this evening, if we could come back for the executive session 1:45, if that's okay. And I would ask everybody to let the planning committee members go first to the lunch buffet, so we can get on with the business.
This was what Ken really wanted to say.